Hey guys, enjoy these new 20 stories. We hope you enjoy them. Let us know your thoughts. And as always, most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button too. It's free and does so much for us. We're forever grateful. Now to the stories.
I'd never thought a simple coffee date could turn into the strangest psychology experiment of my life. It all started when Ubaid's profile popped up on that new dating app I downloaded. I was swiping more out of curiosity than anything else. His photo showed a relaxed guy in his early 30s, typing away on a laptop in a co-working space, grabbing lunch with friends on a rooftop, even sketching algorithms on a whiteboard in a startup office. He had that geek chic vibe I found cute, and his bio boasted about favorite programming languages, gaming marathons, and weekend hackathons. Honestly, it felt like we were a perfect match. Two nerds in a world full of gym selfies and filtered brunch pics. We started chatting late one night after I finished binge watching my latest obsession. His messages were witty, full of tech jokes and clever observations about human behavior. He asked me which video games got me hooked, what sci-fi films blew my mind, and why I thought psychology was the coolest field ever. At first, I thought he was just being flirtatious, but over the next few days it felt like he was genuinely curious about everything I did. My taste in music, a weird habit of making spreadsheets for my fantasy football league, even my childhood obsession with detective novels. After a week of messaging, he suggested meeting up downtown at a cozy cafe that boasted free Wi-Fi and board games on every table. He framed it as the perfect setting for some light social experiments. I was intrigued. Who wouldn't want a date that felt like an experiment? In my head, I pictured something fun, maybe playing Clue to test deductive reasoning or swapping childhood stories to gauge empathy levels. I got dressed in my favorite hoodie and jeans, grabbed my backpack, and headed out, excited to meet a 32-year-old software engineer who seemed as much like me as two people could be. When I arrived, I scanned the cafe and spotted a man waving from a corner table. He had salt and pepper hair, a receding hairline, and the kind of lines around his eyes you get from decades of laughing and frowning. He stood up, and I realized he looked nothing like the guy in the photos. No tech-savvy 30-something, but someone who could have been 49 or 50. My heart sank when I saw the woman sitting next to him. She looked startled, and I suddenly felt like a fool before I even sat down. I introduced myself, trying to keep my voice steady. The man, who called himself Ubaid, invited me to sit, but his voice trembled when he spoke. The first few minutes were awkward. I stared at my live phone, pretending to sip while I processed the lie. Then Ubaid cleared his throat and began explaining. He'd used his son's photos, someone in his 20s who actually looked like the profile, to see how younger women respond for his research. He stuttered through jargon about variables, control groups, and hypothesis testing. It all sounded like he turned human emotions into data points. My palms started sweating. He said his wife knew every detail and even approved. Apparently, she sometimes sat in on video calls, taking notes. His son didn't mind either. He was curious and thought it was a cool project. All of it felt creepy. Every sweet text message, every carefully crafted compliment had been bait to gather data. When he asked what I thought so far, I almost laughed. This wasn't a psychology lecture, it was real life. I told him I needed air and bolted out the cafe door. Outside, my heart pounded so hard I thought it would leap out of my chest. I watched through the window as Ubaid finished his coffee, scribbling something in a leather notebook. I felt relief that I'd recognized the lie early, but also a bizarre kind of pity. How many other women had he tricked? What conclusions would he draw from their reactions? Later that afternoon, I called my best friend and spilled the entire story. We laughed and cursed him, but I could hear that she was worried I'd been traumatized. I felt foolish, but also strangely proud that I'd had the strength to stand up and leave. I deleted his profile, blocked his number, and tried, unsuccessfully at first, to move on. Every time I logged back into the app, I wondered how many more experiments were out there, hidden behind stolen faces. Over the next week, I found myself replaying the date in my head. I imagined confronting him online with screenshots, exposing him to the entire app. Other times, I felt a weird surge of empathy. Maybe the man behind the lie was so lonely that trickery felt easier than the risk of genuine rejection. But every time I returned to the same conclusion. No matter how curious you are, people's feelings aren't lab specimens. To reclaim my sense of control, I started documenting my dating disasters in a private blog. I turned the awkward coffee shop moment into a humorous anecdote, complete with exaggerated footnotes about control samples and participant consent. Writing it down felt cathartic, like turning a nightmare into a quirky story I could own. A month later, I found myself in a different cafe on a rainy afternoon, swiping through profiles once more, because despite Yubay's deception, I still believed in finding real connections. I spotted a new match, a smiling woman holding a rescue dog, posing in front of a mountain trail. Her bio described weekend hikes, amateur baking disasters, and a love for cheesy 80s movies. It felt refreshingly genuine. I sent a friendly hi and waited, holding my breath. When her reply popped up, no jargon, just a question about my favorite pizza topping, I smiled. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. No experiments, no stolen faces, just two humans trying to figure out if they've got something in common. So that's where the story ends for me, sitting here with my umbrella dripping on the cafe floor, swiping with cautious optimism, and listening for anything that sounds like a real person. No more lats paid for by liars, no more free Wi-Fi research, and definitely no more social experiments. Because despite everything, I still believe genuine connections are out there. You just have to be brave enough to leave the fake profiles behind and meet people face to face. No data collection necessary. I thought I'd met the perfect sweet curvy girl with glasses when her profile popped up one evening while I was killing time on the subway. Her pictures were exactly my type. Warm smile behind oversized frames, soft waves of hair, and outfits that looked like they came straight out of a cozy indie film. She captioned one pic book hoarder, holding a stack of vintage paperbacks, and another coffee addict, sipping a latte with whipped cream. Her bio talked about loving knitting circles, cheesy rom-coms, and volunteering at the animal shelter. I was already picturing lazy Sunday mornings, her curled up next to me in a cardigan reading mystery novels. We started messaging, and it was perfect, light banter, movie recommendations, memes about cat videos. She told me she was in her mid-20s, worked at a small publishing house, and had a massive sweet tooth. She joked about her obsession with gummy bears and posted a selfie wearing heart-shaped sunglasses that made her look like a total goofball. Honestly, I was smitten. This was the kind of person I'd waited ages to meet, quirky, genuine, and effortlessly cute. After a week of chatting, she suggested meeting at a quaint cafe near the old library downtown. She said it had the best chai latte in the city and a secret back room full of board games. I couldn't wait. I wore my favorite flannel shirt, practiced my fun but not too eager greeting in the mirror, and headed out early to claim the best seat. When I arrived, I spotted her immediately. At least I thought I did. A figure stood by the counter adjusting a blonde wig so it fell just right over a high ponytail. She wore a pastel dress and carried a canvas tote that said bookworm in cursive. But as I got closer, my heart sank. The sweet, curvy girl from the photos was gone. In her place was a lean man in his 40s with stubble on his chin and kind, worried eyes. The wig didn't fit perfectly, and when he turned, I caught the edge of a receding hairline and broad shoulders that didn't match the silhouette from the pictures. My stomach dropped. He smiled nervously, holding out a hand that looked like it had seen too many board game battles. "Thanks for coming," he said, voice low but steady. I sank into the chair opposite him, speechless. For a moment, I wondered if this was some kind of prank. My mind raced. Is this a hidden camera show? Am I the joke? He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. The cafe's indie rock playlist hummed in the background, and I stared at the chai latte they'd brought, steam swirling up like magic smoke. Eventually he spoke. I wasn't exactly honest. He explained that he'd been feeling invisible online, ignored, overlooked, and desperate to feel wanted for once. He borrowed photos of his niece, who really was a sweet curvy girl with glasses, to see if anyone would actually pay attention to him if he looked like her. I pinched the bridge of my nose and forced myself to listen. He talked about how real women rarely get the attention they deserve, how dating apps were cruel, how he just wanted to know what it felt like to be pursued. He avoided my gaze as he confessed he wasn't interested in a relationship. This was more like a self-esteem project. He said he'd never met anyone in person before and didn't know how to handle it when I showed up. My mind flashed back to every she in his messages. The jokes about rom-com tropes, the photos of cute coffee moments, even the little heart emojis. It felt like every moment had been a lie. I thought of how excited I'd been, how I'd imagined her laugh, the way she'd tuck hair behind her ear. Instead, I sat across from a man who looked like he'd seen a lifetime of rejection. When he finally looked up, his eyes were a mixture of relief and guilt. He said, "I'm sorry." That tiny phrase hung in the air while I tried to sort through disappointment, anger at something else, a weird sliver of empathy. Maybe he was so starved for validation that impersonation seemed easier than risking real rejection. But it was still a betrayal. I stood up, my chafe forgotten, and stepped outside to catch my breath. The night air was cool, and the city lights blurred as my eyes burned. I didn't know what I was feeling, hurt maybe, but also a strange kind of pity. I wondered how many times he'd done this, how many strangers had he tricked into caring about a persona that didn't exist. The man, still wearing that wig, followed me outside. He tried to say something, but I shook my head. I walked away, my boots clacking on the pavement, thinking about how easy it is to be whoever you want online. Behind every profile might be someone hiding behind a mask, literally or figuratively. Over the next few days, I replayed the encounter over and over. I imagined confronting him again, demanding real answers, or maybe telling his niece what he'd done. But mostly I just felt tired of having my expectations toyed with. I decided to take a break from that app, delete it from my phone, and focus on meeting people in the real world, book readings, volunteer events, that kind of thing. A week later, I found myself at a charity bake sale for the shelter where I volunteer. I was chatting with someone about gluten-free cupcakes when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the man in the wig, except this time the hair was shorter and his posture less nervous. He was holding out a pamphlet for a local support group on social isolation. "I thought you might want this," he said. I stared at the flyer, weekly meetups, discussions, real people sharing real stories. I realized he'd signed up for it too. No photo filters, no borrowed faces. Just people who wanted to be seen. I took the pamphlet and nodded. He offered a small, genuine smile, and I gave one back. I didn't know what would come next. Maybe he'd change, maybe he wouldn't. But as I walked away with that pamphlet clutched in my hand, I felt like I found something better than a perfect profile, a reminder that behind every screen is someone looking for connection, flaws and all. And for now, that had to be enough. I'd never thought a simple plan to meet a new friend would turn into one of the weirdest nights of my life. It started when I stumbled onto his profile during a late-night scroll. He looked like the kind of guy who hit the gym every morning before breakfast. Broad shoulders, chiseled jawline, and a crisp button-down shirt that made him look like he'd just walked off a magazine cover. His pictures showed him hiking mountain trails, sipping protein shakes, and throwing perfect spiral passes on a football field. His bio bragged about weekend triathlons and Sunday morning yoga sessions. Honestly, I was impressed. This was way beyond my usual type, but something about that clean-cut vibe pulled me in. We matched, and our first few messages felt effortless. He asked about my favorite movies, shared workout playlists, and even challenged me to a push-up contest over text. I laughed at his goofy GIS and admired his dedication to fitness. He said he was in his early 30s, worked at a tech startup, and spent his free time training for Ironman races. After a week of chatting, he suggested we grab a drink at this trendy rooftop bar downtown. I was excited to meet someone so active. I pictured us swapping gym tips while watching the sunset over the city. On the night of the date, I showed up early, scanning the rooftop for a familiar face. The place was packed with people in athleisure gear and neon sneakers. My heart did a little flip when I saw him, almost. A big guy was standing by the bar, his round belly poking out from under a beer-stained t-shirt. His breath smelled faintly of stale alcohol, and he slurred my name when he waved me over. My mouth went dry. This was not the guy who sprouted from his profile pictures like an Instagram warrior. I forced a smile and sat down, trying to keep my cool. He offered me a bottle of hard cider and introduced himself as Ads, though his voice sounded thicker than I expected. I stared at his shirt, which looked more like the attire of a frat house night than a rooftop bar. I couldn't process it all at once. The sweaty t-shirt, the unkempt beard stubble, the wobble in his gait. He laughed when I asked if he'd done a workout that day, admitting he had cracked open a six-pack while watching a game. I figured there might be a good explanation for this mismatch. Maybe he had an emergency or a snack craving before meeting up. When I asked about the hiking pictures and marathon selfies, he shrugged and said, "That's my cousin's face. People like that mug better than mine. He sounded proud, like he discovered the ultimate life hack. He said he tried showing his real photos before, but nobody swiped right, so he borrowed his cousin's images to attract matches. Then, when they met and found out the truth, he declared himself ironically honest and watched their reactions like it was some twisted performance art. My heart pounded and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I pictured all the times I'd texted and giggled at his fitness routines, only to realize none of it was real. It all felt like salt in a wound. I asked why he bothered messaging me at all, and he said he was bored and curious about how strangers react when they realize the profile they swooned over belonged to a totally different person. He called it social observation and assured me it was harmless fun. I stared at my drink, now tasting like regret, while he wound out sample sizes and user behavior trends. Every word felt like a punch to my gut. I wanted to stand up and yell, but instead I just nodded, trying to mask the flood of irritation. He offered to order more cider, but I waved him off and reached for my phone. I pretended I got a sudden message and told him I needed to step outside for a minute. Outside, the cool air hit me, and I leaned against the railing overlooking the neon cityscape. I texted my best friend to explain the situation. This guy's my WTF moment of the week. And she answered back with laughing emojis and sympathetic comments. I laughed too, but it felt hollow, like a reflex. I realized how easy it had been to fall for a picture. All those carefully curated shots of mountain peaks and protein bars had blinded me to the person behind them. After a few minutes, I went back inside, determined to wrap this up. I found him leaning on the bar, finishing off a cider. When he saw me, he patted the stool next to him and said, "You back? Cool. You want another round?" I shook my head and told him I was done for the night. He looked surprised, like I just canceled his grand social experiment. He asked why I was leaving. I said I had an early morning. He shrugged, as if that answered everything. I slipped out, paid my share of the drinks, and walked off into the night. The city lights blurred above me, and I felt a weird mix of relief and disbelief. I thought about how he gambled with my trust for the sake of a twisted game. I wondered if he'd ever stop to actually connect with someone for real. The next day, I deleted the app and decided to stick to meeting people through friends or at events where I could see them in action. No more trusting profiles filled with someone else's accomplishments. I realized I let myself chase an image instead of a genuine person. As for ads, I hope you learned that people are more than their Instagram highlights, and that honesty might just be the better strategy. Life went on, and I moved past the memory of that rooftop bar and the chunky stranger who smelled like cider and confusion. I found myself at a yoga class a few weeks later. Real people, real sweat, and no screen between us. I spotted someone in the mirror doing tree pose like a pro and struck up a conversation afterward. No borrowed photos, no beer breath, just two humans getting through balance on one foot. And that, I decided, was exactly where I wanted to be, meeting people face to face with all their quirks and flaws on display. Because after getting played by a stranger's cousin, I was ready for something genuine, even if it meant skipping the highlight reel and dealing with real life instead. It kicked off when I stumbled on a profile that looked like a fitness influencer takeover. She, at least that's how her pictures told it, posed in brightly lit gyms, lifting heavy dumbbells with perfect form, flexing lean muscles in neon leggings, and running along misty trails at sunrise. Every shot had that epic "I woke up at 5 a.m. to chase endorphins" energy. Her bio bragged out being a gym rat, a certified yoga instructor, and a smoothie bowl connoisseur. I'm not exactly a gym bro, but I admired dedication, and I thought, here's someone whose hustle might rub off on me. We matched, and the first few messages were a vibe. She sent snaps of her post-workout shakes, tons of berries, weird powders, and so much kale I could taste the chlorophyll. She bragged about her favorite boxing class playlist and asked if I'd ever tried indoor rock climbing. I played along, telling half-truths about my runs, playing it cool. We flirted over protein snack suggestions and geeking out on fitness apps. I was already imagining tag teaming on morning jogs and swapping kale salad recipes over candlelit dinners. After a few days of chat, she suggested meeting at that upscale juice bar near the riverfront. She swore by their acai bowls and claimed they'd do a smoothie demo if I showed up. I planned the perfect casual athleisure outfit: leggings, a loose tank, my worn sneakers, and mapped out my route so I wouldn't be late. I even practiced my best I lift weights to small talk in the mirror. When I arrived, I scanned the minimalist cafe decked out in pastel colors and succulents. I didn't see a fit yogi sculpting her biceps. Instead, I noticed a frail figure wheeled in on a medical chair, blankets draped over knees, eyes closed. My heart pounded as I approached. This was clearly not the Instagram goddess who'd been sending me smoothie selfies. I stopped next to the wheelchair and realized the person had a thin hospital gown under a cardigan. Lines of a nasal cannula peeked beneath his chin, and his arms looked as fragile as dried twigs. I choked on a gulp of air and forced myself to sit on the edge of a nearby bench. He, because it turned out to be a he, opened his eyes and offered a small, apologetic smile. "I know this is awkward," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Sweat beaded at my temples while I fought to keep my expression neutral. My brain scrambled through every possible scenario: prank show, viral video plot, some kind of performance art. He explained that the profile was managed by his younger brother. The real deal was this: he'd been bedridden for months after a severe accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. His brother had taken over the Instagram account to keep it alive, posting fitness photos from the brother's own gym sessions, while acting like it was all this guy's content. Apparently, he wanted to meet people without the pity or shock that his condition might bring. The experiment's part was just him oversharing the term to justify the ruse. My pulse slowed as he continued. He'd been stuck in rehab, going through endless therapy sessions, and his brother thought it'd be easier to find someone if his profile kept the illusion of health. He said he was lonely, tired of superficial pity, and wanted to see if someone would like him for who he was now, wheelchair and all, if he had the chance to meet them without the filter. He admitted he'd never told me because he feared rejection or the conversation dying the instant I saw him. I stared at the smooth wooden table in front of me, tracing the grain with my eyes. I remembered those smoothies he'd sent pictures of, loaded with chia seeds and spirulina. None of those were his. They were concocted by his brother. Every motivational quote he'd shared about pushing through a tough workout was recycled from a fitness influencer. My chest tightened as I realized I'd been falling for someone who didn't exist, an avatar curated by a sibling's idea of what would succeed online. When he asked how I felt, I blinked hard. I didn't want to appear cruel or heartless. I shook my head and searched for words. "I'm sorry you've been stepped like this," I said. My voice cracked, and I cleared my throat. He nodded, eyes downcast, clearly relieved that I hadn't stormed off. The cafe hum faded as I processed it all. The loneliness of hospital rooms, the brother's desperate fix to maintain a normal life, and the vulnerability this man showed by meeting me blind. I reached out and rested a hand on the wheelchair's armrest. "Let's get those acai bowls," I said. He looked at me, surprised, as if no one had offered him a lifeline in months. We rolled across the cafe floor, and I fussed over menus as if I knew what smoothies he wanted. He laughed, a small sound that felt like sunshine, when I accidentally ordered the extra protein scoop without asking. We talked about nothing and everything. His therapy schedule, my awkward attempts at morning runs, the music we both liked. I realized it wasn't about swapping salad recipes. It was about making someone feel seen when they'd been trapped behind medical walls. We spent almost 2 hours there, sharing smoothies that were way too sweet, trading jokes about workout fails, and laughing at my terrible puns. I learned that he loved classic rock, hated mint-flavored protein, and could quote lines from old sitcoms. His wheelchair made it hard to navigate certain parts of the cafe, so I offered him a push whenever we moved. The day that had started as an illusion turned into one of the most genuine afternoons I'd had in a long time. When it was time to go, he asked if I'd meet him again. No lies, no filters. I said yes. I walked him to the elevator, where we talked about fun things like visiting art galleries and taking a pottery class. It struck me how simple it was to connect when honesty led the way. I promised to text him later about weekend plans, and we parted with a real smile. No borrowed photos, no fake fitness feats. Later that night, I deleted our chat from my mind's junk folder. I tossed the sugary smoothie receipt into my bag and hit the city streets feeling lighter. The story of a gym goddess had been a fantasy, but the story of a vulnerable man craving real connection was something I couldn't resist. And that's how an afternoon that looked like a fitness demo morphed into a lesson about truth. Being genuine matters more than having the perfect filter. I still love smoothies, but now I prefer them alongside someone who shows up just as they are, no illusions attached. I've been flirting with the idea of trying a premium dating app, one that promised curated profiles and face-to-face introductions. And when Nemo's profile appeared, I was intrigued. His photos were flawless, high contrast shots of a tall, broad-shouldered guy with perfect skin and a jawline that looked sculpted by Greek gods. He smiled like he just landed the lead in a Netflix show, and each image felt like it belonged in a magazine. His bio hinted at art gallery openings, sailboat weekends, and a love of vintage jazz. We matched, and the chat kicked off with playful banter about 1950s record players versus modern streaming. He sent me a short video of himself flipping through vinyl in a dimly lit loft, and I caught a glimpse of the city skyline behind him. I was hooked. Over the next few days, we traded playlists, my indie folk favorites for his Smokey Miles Davis picks, and teased each other about who could find the rarest jazz record. When he suggested meeting at the new bistro overlooking the harbor, I rush-booked a table for two with a view of the yachts. On the evening of our date, I arrived early, stepping off the water taxi onto the polished wooden dock. Lanterns floated above the walkway, casting a soft glow on rippling water. The restaurant's glass facade reflected the golden lights, and I felt that flutter in my chest you get when anticipation meets romance. I smoothed my dress and checked my phone for his ETA. The hostess led me to a table by the window, where two candles flickered in the gentle breeze. When I looked up for Nemo, I stopped breathing for a moment. Standing there was a man no taller than 5 feet, his shoulders hunched slightly under a dark jacket. His face was marred by scaring, pockmarks, and thin, silver lines crisscrossed his cheeks. He wore an awkward smile, as if he just climbed a mountain he wasn't sure he could summit. My mind reeled. This was not the polished model who had swept me off my feet online. 1,000 questions crashed through my head before I even said hello. He slid into the seat across from me, his movements careful, almost tentative. The city lights danced in his eyes as he glanced out of the harbor, then back at me. For a few seconds, silence hung between us, filled only by the soft clink of glassware and distant laughter from other diners. I forced a calm smile and positioned my napkin on my lap. The waiter handed us menus, and I busied myself scanning wine lists while Nemo cleared his throat. He spoke quietly, explaining that the photos I'd seen were not his. He admitted he'd borrowed someone else's online persona, a friend who worked as a commercial model, to test whether anyone would swipe right on the real version of him. When I glanced up, his gaze was earnest and guarded. He said, I knew no one would swipe on the real me, skirt and short, so I borrowed someone else's life. His voice cracked on the last word, and I realized I was staring at someone who had spent untold hours hiding behind a perfect facade. In that moment, I remembered each sparkling image he'd sent me, the crisp tailored suits, the flawless skin, the confident stance. All of it had been borrowed. I felt a jolt of confusion and, if I'm honest, a pang of betrayal. He excused himself to the restroom, and I sat there alone, hands gripping my glass of Rosa as if it might anchor me. I wanted to storm out to yell that trust is not a lab experiment. Instead, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded myself to hear him out. When he returned, his face was more composed, but still visibly tense. He ordered water, leaving the menus untouched. The lights reflecting on the wine glass made patterns on the tablecloth, while I waited for him to continue. Eventually, he began to unravel his story. Growing up bullied for his appearance, years spent trying to camouflage himself in crowds, endless nights wondering what it would feel like to be seen as handsome. He talked about the dating app's hidden analytics that showed how many profiles got attention based solely on looks, and how he couldn't face the cold reality that his face would never measure up. As he spoke, I watched the flicker of candlelight highlight the contours of his scars. The jagged lines told the story of survival. Maybe an accident, maybe something else, but there was dignity in the way he carried himself now. He confessed that seeing those model snaps on his own profile had given him hope, even though it was false. He needed to experience that rush of matches, that feeling of validation, even if it was stolen. He believed that by living someone else's life online, he could gather data on reactions and finally understand why he felt invisible. My heart pounded, but I tried to separate the deceit from the man before me. After he finished, I forced a thoughtful nod. I told him I needed a moment to collect my thoughts. He nodded, eyes downcast, and I leaned back in my chair, staring at the harbor lights. I realized this was no longer about a perfect date. It was about witnessing someone's vulnerability laid bare under candlelight. I turned back to him. Why come here? Why meet me in person after leading me on? His eyes flicked up, meeting mine for the first time directly. He took a shallow breath. "Because I needed to feel something real," he said. "I thought if I could get you here with a fake me, I could see if you'd still care about the person underneath." His hands clenched the water glass, knuckles white. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I didn't want to pretend I wasn't hurt, but I also didn't want to abandon him in that moment. I asked if he'd ever tried telling his truth instead of hiding behind another man's face. Tears glistened in his eyes as he admitted that genuine honesty had always ended in ghosted messages and silent matches. He shook his head as if explaining a scientific law he couldn't break. People swipe on beauty, not on stories of survival. My phone buzzed with an email alert, but I ignored it. I realized that the perfect photos were nothing more than algorithms' favorite variables, and the headphones he'd sent me in a picture were probably someone else's. I took a deep breath and said, "You're here now, face to face." That takes more courage than any fake profile ever did. He blinked, clearly surprised by my words. The waiter returned and poured water into our glasses. I asked about the chef's special, and we ordered a modest shared plate of roasted vegetables and grilled fish. Conversation shifted to neutral ground. Favorite childhood cartoons, the smell of rain on asphalt, the songs that made us dance like fools when no one was watching. He laughed, truly laughed, for the first time that night, and I saw a flicker of something hopeful in his eyes. The breeze off the water rustled the napkins. I thought about how easy it is to craft a fiction online, but how rare it is to reveal the messy parts of ourselves. We traded stories about travel mishaps and cooking disasters, and I felt myself leaning in, genuinely curious about who this man was beyond his scars. The evening light faded to twilight, and the harbor lights brightened, reflecting on rippling waves. When we finally stood to leave, I realized hours had passed. I slipped into my coat, and he offered me his hand. Instead of shoving it away, I accepted, and he guided me through the restaurant's grand glass doors. Outside, the night air was cool, full of the salt tang of the sea. We paused on the dock, looking out at the water. He turned to me and said, "I know this is a lot to ask, but would you meet me again? No borrowed faces, just me." I studied his face, every scar, every line, and saw the man who had chosen vulnerability over illusion. I nodded, and his relief was almost visible. We exchanged a quick, shy smile before parting ways. I walked back to the water taxi dock, heart lighter than when I'd arrived. The skyline's reflection shimmered on the water, and I realized that beneath every carefully curated image, there's a real person waiting to be seen. Sometimes you have to let go of the fantasy to find something genuine. Tonight, I'd gotten a glimpse of that truth, and it was better than any model's perfect smile. The first time I saw her profile, I felt like I'd stepped into a glossy magazine spread. Every image was dripping with style. Tailored leather jackets, perfectly tousled hair catching sunlight, and makeup so flawless it seemed painted on by an airbrush. She posed in minimalist lofts, leaning against exposed brick with a latte in hand that looked almost too pretty to drink. Her captions were all about chic weekend getaways and designer finds, and I remember thinking I'd never met someone so effortlessly glamorous. I bookmarked her profile, convinced my life needed a bit of that polish. After a few weeks of anxious swiping, she finally messaged me. "Hey, hope her day's going well." I nearly dropped my phone. She asked if I wanted to meet at that trendy rooftop lounge with a skyline view, and I said yes so fast I'm pretty sure I forgot how to breathe. I spent days planning, ironing my best button-down shirt, practicing a casual smile in the mirror, and picking out cologne that said I might be artsy. By the time Saturday night rolled around, I felt like I was suiting up for a movie premiere. When I got there, the lounge was everything I'd imagined: low lights, sleek metal tables, cocktails served in geometric vessels. I spotted her near the bar, but not the sleek, glamorous type from her photos. She was slumped in a stained hoodie that looked like it had lived through several spilled drinks, her hair greasy and pulled back in a crooked bun. She brushed a strand of oily brown hair off her face, revealing teeth that were yellowed and chipped. My heart did a weird flip-flop. This wasn't the picture-perfect influencer I'd been daydreaming about. She offered a shy wave, and I plastered on my practiced smile. I realized that my movie premiere outfit felt suddenly out of place next to her rumpled hoodie and scuffed sneakers. As I sat down, she looked awkward in that oversized hoodie, fiddling with the cuff as if she could blend into the neon-lit walls. The bartender poured us each a gin and tonic, and I tried to focus on the drink instead of my racing thoughts. She leaned forward, eyes flicking around before settling on mine. "Sorry," she said, voice low. "You were expecting someone else." I nodded, mouth dry. I asked if she was okay, and she shrugged. "I only clean up for the camera," she admitted. "My whole profile is an illusion." She tapped her hoodie. "This is me when I'm not playing dress-up." My mind spun. Everything I thought I'd known about her, the designer finds, the perfect makeup blend, was a carefully curated act. I realized I'd been chasing a highlight reel, not a person. I should have felt angry or cheated, but instead I felt a strange tug of curiosity. Who was this person behind the filters and fancy shots? We moved to a quieter corner, and she told me about her daytime life, working an entry-level retail job at a discount store, dealing with rude customers and endless price checks. She lived in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, filled with hand-me-down furniture from her grandmother. Her real mornings started with 2-minute showers and toothpaste so cheap it barely foamed. She saved up every paycheck just to rent the photographer's studio space once a month for her boudoir sessions and fashion shoots. She said she kept up the illusion online because she wanted someone who'd love the real her, not just the shiny version. She needed to see if anyone could ignore the stains and the chipped paint on her walls and still want to wake up next to her coffee-stained sheets. She looked at me and asked if that was too weird. I paused, thinking of her perfect photos. From her perspective, those were like costumes hiding the cracks underneath. I told her I could see both sides of her now, the flawless queen of style and the hoodie-huddled girl trying to get by. I admitted I felt a little cheated, but also impressed. It takes guts to post your best self and then show someone your worst. She smiled, a mix of relief and vulnerability that washed away any hint of glamour. We laughed about the absurdity of it all. She told me about the time she accidentally spilled coffee on her white blouse during a shoot and had to Photoshop around the stain. I admitted I once wore my shirt backwards to a job interview and didn't notice until halfway through. The more she talked, the more real she became, like the perfect photos had been an invitation to something deeper. We stayed at that rooftop lounge talking for hours, sharing stories about our crummy apartments, bad dates, and the stuff we hid from the world. I found myself leaning in, forgetting the candles and skyline, and focusing on her face as it really looked scars, chipped teeth, and all. In the yellow glow of the bar lights, she laughed like a normal person, not a magazine model. When the bartender flicked the lights back on, announcing last call, I realized we'd outlasted the rooftop's fancy hours. I offered to walk her home, and she accepted, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. The cool night air felt like a reset button, blowing away the pretense of cocktails and photo shoots. As we wandered down narrow city streets, I noticed the graffiti on the walls and the stray cats lurking in alleys, real life, in all its messy glory. At her building, she paused under the dim hallway light and asked if I still wanted to see her again. "Nobody required," she said with a grin. I said yes without hesitation. She gave me a quick hug, awkward but genuine, and unlocked the door to her apartment. Inside, the peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture greeted me, and I felt at home. She offered me a seat on a sagging cushion and poured us water from a dented kettle. No fancy glassware, just two people sitting, sharing real space. We talked until my phone buzzed with a reminder that I had work in the morning. I grabbed my jacket and stood up, feeling oddly full, like I'd swallowed something warm and comforting. She walked me to the door, dropped an envelope into my hand, and closed it. "Open it later," she said. Outside, I peeked inside the envelope and found one of her glossy photos, the same perfect shot she posted online. On the back, she'd written, "Just a reminder that we all have our frames. Feel free to see both." I slipped it into my pocket, grinning at the thought. I headed home under the streetlights, thinking about the hoodie, the broken teeth, the greasy hair, everything that made her real. I realized it wasn't the perfect photos I'd been chasing, but the person behind them. And for the first time, I didn't care about the filter. I just cared that she showed me the world beyond it, hoodie and all. I figured university coffee shops were the safest bet for meeting someone who claimed to be a grad student. There's always that mix of nervous energy, the hum of espresso machines, and someone flipping through thick textbooks. So when Kev's profile popped up, photos of a guy in his late 20s with a crisp blazer, textbook in hand, scribbling furiously in a lecture hall, I thought I found someone I could really connect with. His bio mentioned advanced research in neuroscience, midnight library sessions, and an affection for indie bands with names no one's heard of. I was in. We messaged back and forth about our favorite campus hangouts, debated whether caffeine was the secret sauce of productivity, and joked about pulling all-nighters. He sent me a selfie framed by rows of books. I swear it looked straight out of a campus brochure. I loved that he called himself a thesis warrior and posted a snap of an empty coffee cup beside a stack of research articles. It all felt authentic, like I was talking to someone actively carving out their future. After a week of messaging, he suggested meeting at the grad lounge in the old humanities building. He said it was quiet on weekday afternoons, and the vintage armchairs made it feel more like a library living room. I picked a sunny spot by the window, my heart thumping with anticipation. I carried my notebook and favorite pen, ready to talk shop or just chat about life. I even rehearsed a casual greeting. "Hey, you must be Kev." Nice to finally meet the mastermind behind those neuroscience theories. When I walked in, the lounge was exactly as he described. Dusty bookcases, faded armchairs, and a single floor lamp casting a warm glow. But the guy waiting by the coffee station was nothing like the polished grad student in photos. He looked closer to 60 than 30, with sunken eyes that seemed to hide in dark circles and a shaky smile that revealed dentures. His posture was hunched, shoulders rounded as if burdened by years of carrying secrets. He wore a worn cardigan and trousers that had probably seen better days. My chest tightened. For a split second, I wondered if I'd walked into the wrong room. He spotted me and gave a nervous wave, clutching a battered travel mug. I tried to muster a friendly smile as I approached. My notebook felt suddenly heavy in my bag. "Hi," I said, voice catching. "Kev." He nodded and motioned to a threadbare sofa. I sat down, heart pounding. He'd offered me coffee from his mug, stale and lukewarm, and apologized for not grabbing something fresh. I accepted because I needed time to process. The guy I'd sent messages to, swapped research links with, and teased about caffeine dependence was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he'd stepped right out of a midlife crisis. He cleared his throat. "I know this is a shock," he said, tracing the edge of his mug. His dentures clicked when he swallowed. "I'm not really a grad student." My stomach sank. I stared at his cardigan, staring back at me like a confession. He explained that his ex-wife had made him feel invisible for years, like his voice, his opinions. Even his looks didn't matter anymore. She'd always dismissed him, treated him like furniture. When she filed for divorce, he lost more than a partner. He lost a sense of self. He looked down at his hands, fingers curled around the mug's handle. "My son's in his 20s, he said. "He's tall, fit, smart. He looked like the kind of guy people actually notice." I thought if I borrowed his photos, I could feel seen again. He kept the borrowed face alive online, messaging anyone who'd swipe right. The moment someone agreed to meet his son, bless him, sent along a picture of his old man recovering from surgery, but that was supposed to stay hidden behind the profile. My mind buzzed. The witty banter about synaptic pathways, the shared playlists of obscure showgaze bands, the midnight memes, none of it was his. It was all borrowed, curated by imagination or desperation. I wanted to be angry, but I felt torn between anger and pity. He spoke with quiet regret, describing how he'd spend hours practicing the youthful tone in his messages, hunching over his phone pretending those ideas were his own. Every plan to meet was a gamble, with the other person bail the second they saw his real face. For him, it was a twisted experiment in self-worth. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, trying to calm the rush of emotions. The coffee shop buzzed softly around us, but the sunlit window felt miles away. I thought of all the late-night chats we'd had, the way he teased me about my obsession with cold brew ratios. None of that was real. I asked how he felt in those moments, hiding behind his son's life. He winced at the question, lips trembling. The text felt alive, he said. But every time a new message appeared, I wondered if it was a profile talking or the real me. I stared at his hollow eyes and felt a knot in my throat. He clasped his mug with both hands, as if it were an anchor. I remembered how he called himself a thesis warrior and posted that smug selfie by the bookshelves. It made me ache to think of the void he must have felt every time he opened our conversation history. I realized this wasn't about the proofs of neuroscience or the caffeine in his drinks. It was about a man desperate to matter. I took a deep breath. "Why tell me now?" I asked. His head dipped. "I couldn't lie anymore," he whispered. Every morning, I'd wake up regretting the illusion. My son started asking questions. My ex-wife was moving on. I was running out of explanations. He sighed and drained the last of the coffee. I wanted to come clean before he found out in some cruel way. Silence stretched between us while I processed his confession. The weight of his loneliness was tangible. I wanted to comfort him, but part of me felt naive for trusting a screen. I wondered if I'd been fooled not just by his photos, but by my own hope to find someone who shared my world. I thought about my own messages, the times I'd laugh at his jokes, the insider tips he'd given me on campus events, all built on a lie. I closed my notebook and met his gaze. I'm hurt, I admitted, and I'm disappointed, but I can't stand the thought of you feeling invisible. My voice shook. He looked surprised that I wasn't just going to walk away. I realized none of the scripted lines I'd prepared mattered now. You deserve to be seen for who you are, I said. His eyes glistened. I'm scared, he said. I don't know what comes next. I shifted on the sofa, folding my hands. How about we start over? I offered. No borrowed photos, no grad student persona. Just you, me, and bad cold brew in the grad lounge. A small, genuine smile flickered on his face, short-lived, but real. He nodded, exhaling like a weight had lifted. We spent the next hour talking about his real life, the model trains he restored in his basement, the day he tried making a souffle and ended up with scrambled eggs, the light in his son's eyes when he finally saw him as a father, not a failed spouse. I shared my embarrassing karaoke story and how I'd once tried breakdancing at a friend's wedding. The conversation felt awkward at first, but it was honest, messy, and entirely human. When the coffee shop announced closing time, we stood and stretched. I offered to walk into the car park behind the building. Outside, the sun was sinking low, casting golden light across the courtyard. The shadows grew long, and I realized I'd been here for hours. He paused by his little hatchback and turned to me. Thanks for giving me a chance, he said. I know it won't be easy. I smiled and tapped his shoulder. Nothing worth it ever is. He climbed into the driver's seat, and I watched the exhaust puff in the cool evening air. As he drove away, I felt a strange mix of relief and hope. I hadn't signed up to date a grad student, but I had met someone who needed to know he mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly the kind of connection I had been looking for all along. I'd never expected a brunch invite to turn into a comedic revelation that felt like it was ripped straight from a prank show. I'd been scrolling through the dating app over breakfast when Diane's profile popped up. She looked like she'd stepped out of a high-fashion magazine. Every shot showed her draped in designer dresses, flawless makeup that highlighted her cheekbones, and hair that fell in perfect waves. One photo had her sipping champagne on a marble terrace, another leaning against a luxury car, and a third gazing dramatically at a sunset in a couture gown. I couldn't resist swiping right. Our chats felt like a dream. She talked about exclusive launches, runway shows, and couture designers. She sent me a video of herself backstage at a Fashion Week event, surrounded by models and clothes racks. I marveled at the backdrop, imagining a world I barely knew existed. She called herself a style Cambrian, and promised that meeting her in person would be like stepping into a hidden boutique filled with surprises. I was hooked by her energy and the idea that we could bond over art exhibitions and champagne tastings. A week later, she suggested brunch at a trendy cafe known for its avocado toast and over-the-top lats. She said the place had killer sangria and a secret rooftop garden, a setting straight out of a romance novel. I dressed up, wearing a button-down and chinos, and rehearsed what I'd say when I saw her glowing in real life. I even double-checked that my camera roll was free of embarrassing photos. No sense giving her more material to tease me with. When I arrived, the cafe was buzzing with influencers posing for stories and photographers snapping shots of pastel pastries. I scanned every stylish outfit, looking for that familiar face framed by designer threads. Instead, I saw a young woman with heavy acne wearing a loose t-shirt 3 sizes too big and hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She sat alone at a corner table, a half-eaten waffle in front of her, looking nervously at her phone. My heart sank because this was nothing like the Diane from the photos. I debated turning around and walking out, but something about her slumped shoulders made me pause. I walked over and said hi, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes lit up in relief as she stood to hug me. I noticed her missing front tooth when she smiled, and my stomach twisted with a mix of curiosity and disappointment. She sat down, and before I could ask any questions, laughed and said, "Surprise, this is the real me." My mouth went dry as I tried to figure out if this was a prank or something more complicated. Between bites of her waffle, she explained, The photos on her profile weren't of her. They were staged shots from a friend's wardrobe and a borrowed makeup artist's portfolio. She ran a social experiment page designed to prove that anyone could get attention if they looked good enough. The twist? Once someone agreed to meet, she'd reveal her real face, heavy egging and all, to see if humor and personality could matter more than looks. She called it the ultimate authenticity test. I blinked, processing her words. She'd worn fake designer outfits in the pictures, then plastered on perfect makeup. And now she sat before me in a baggy t-shirt, no filter, no retouching. My jaw ached from holding back a question. Why? She swallowed and said she was tired of the superficial swipe culture. She wanted to prove that people who made you laugh, who connected with you on a weird, quirky level, deserved more credit than a perfect selfie. She admitted that many matches backed out when they saw her aching or missing tooth, but a handful stayed and laughed along, and those were the ones she called keepers. I stared at the syrup dripping down her waffle, thinking about the promise of that rooftop garden. All her lofty talk of exclusive events felt like background music to this moment of raw honesty. I realized her experiment was part painful, part brave. She was bearing her imperfections to weed out anyone who wouldn't stick around past the surface. That took guts, even if it felt like a bait and switch. She asked what I thought, eyes wide. I cleared my throat and said that I felt tricked but also impressed. It wasn't fair to spring this reveal on someone, but I admired the courage it took to face rejection and still put yourself out there. She shrugged and said rejection is part of the game, but if you can laugh about it, maybe you deserve a shot. She offered me a sip of her latte, pink tinted with beet powder, and I raised an eyebrow at the unusual color, but took a cautious sip. As we talked, the conversation shifted from experiments to genuine connection. She cracked jokes about her teenage braces mishaps, the time she spilled foundation all over her grandmother's sofa, and the ridiculous online dating horror stories she heard. I found myself laughing, really laughing, because behind the flawed exterior was a person who knew how to own her story and turn it into humor. She had a quick wit that made me forget about the perfect screenshots. By the time we polished off our brunch, I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once. We swapped stories about favorite comedy specials and debated which stand-up comics were overrated. I learned she loved obscure podcasts about urban legends, that she tried her hand at improv once, momming spectacularly but loving every second. She didn't need a designer label to shine. Her personality filled the table like confetti. When it was time to go, she gathered her things and smiled. I asked if this meant I passed her test. She laughed and said tests were boring. Better to see if we clicked. She handed me a Polaroid photo she'd taken earlier of our table, complete with syrup stains and coffee rings. On the back she'd scribbled, "No filters, all heart." She slipped it into my pocket and waved goodbye. Walking away, the cafe's neon sign buzzed above me, and I felt oddly energized. I thought about her experiment and how crazy it was, but also how refreshing. In a sea of glossy profiles, she tossed authenticity into the mix and dared people to choose personality over perfection. I looked down at the Polaroid in my pocket, smiling at the messy table. It wasn't a runway shot, but it felt real. That night, I deleted the app notifications piling up on my phone. I kept the Polaroid. I remembered the taste of that beet latte and Diane's unfiltered laugh. She turned deception into a challenge, vulnerability into humor, and imperfect skin into a badge of honor. And somewhere between the waffle bites and candid jokes, I realized the best experiments are the ones that give you a story worth telling. I figured meeting a clean-cut professional at that upscale wine bar was the least risky way to dip my toes back into the dating pool. His profile showed a guy in a crisp dress shirt, neat side-part hairstyle, and a perfectly trimmed beard. Think corporate headshot with a hint of indie film charm. He worked in finance, he said, loved jazz bars and weekend golf outings, and his photos even included snaps of him in front of sleek office towers and polished boardroom tables. I thought, finally, the one who gets the whole work hard, play hard vibe. We exchanged messages about career goals, favorite Bordeaux vintages, and whether remote work was a blessing or a curse. He sent me an invite to join him at a new wine bar downtown that had those fancy tasting flights and dim Edison bulbs. I imagined us sipping Malbec, comparing notes on bold tannins, and chatting about our busy weeks. I dressed in a smart button-up and chinos, styled my hair just right, and headed out, feeling like I was about to score a slam dunk interview, or maybe just a decent date. When I arrived, the place was a movie haven of dark wood and velvet couches. I spotted him sitting at a small table near the back, but what I saw made my jaw drop. Instead of that clean-shaven guy, there was a man with a full neck tattoo swirling up under his collar, prison-style ink etched on his cheeks, and a rough goatee framing lips that moved as he tapped on his phone. His skin looked weathered, his eyes wary, and the vibe was more hard luck story than corporate smooth talker. My heart skipped. I checked my reflection in the wine bar's glass door. My shirt felt suddenly too stiff. I wondered if I'd walked into the wrong spot. He looked up, caught me staring, and offered a hesitant wave that almost felt like asking permission. I took a deep breath and sat down, my brain racing to reconcile the profile of the guy in front of me. He cleared his throat and slid a menu across the table like it might ground him. I glanced down, saw the tasting flights listed, and then back up at him. He braced himself before speaking. "I know this looks different." His voice was low, edged with fatigue. I wasn't honest. My throat tightened. He explained that the profile photos were of his son, someone who graduated college, landed a desk job, and fit neatly into the finance world. The clean-shaven look belonged to a life he once aspired to, long before prison changed everything. My mind flashed to his tattoos, razor scars in the ink, barbed shapes, and a few symbols I didn't recognize. He'd used his son's photos to prove a point about how society judges someone before they even speak. "Corporate America doesn't want you to see this," he said, lifting his jacket slightly to reveal more of a huge chest piece. "They want polished suits, not stories inked on your skin." He talked about rehabbing himself after a stint behind bars, about job interviews that ended before they began, about the shame of being judged on a record instead of a resume. I traced the rim of my wine glass as he unspooled his story. A rough childhood, neighborhood gangs, a single mistake that landed him in a cell for several years. He said he changed inside, got clean, went to counseling, earned certificates in project management. But the second he walked out, the world still saw the ink in the record. No one matched with that guy. So he borrowed his son's face online to see if he could get a chance, then reveal himself in person. He wanted to document reactions, collect data on stigma. My chest ached. I drank a sip of Merlot, feeling its warmth spread through me. I wanted to say something smart, but my mind was tangled. Part of me felt duped, another part felt compassion. He looked at me expectantly, waiting for my reaction. I leaned back and took a steadying breath. "That's a hell of a gamble," I said. He nodded, as if I'd stated the obvious. We ordered a tasting flight and 2 small plates of charcuterie. The first sip of wine settled my nerves a bit. He studied my face, searching for judgment. I focused on the velvet couch, the smell of oak barrels, and let the moment stretch. Then I asked him what drove him to this experiment. He paused, looking away. I just wanted to know if someone would give me a shot if they didn't see prison ink first. His voice cracked, and the bare confession made the quiet hum of the bar feel louder. I thought about all the times I'd skimmed profiles and dismissed someone because they didn't look the part. I judged, too. I picked up a slice of prosciutto and tasted it, chewing thoughtfully. I realized his story deserved more than a swipe-left summary. I set down the meat and met his gaze. "People deserve that chance," I said. "It's not just data. It's someone's life." He blinked, relief flickering across his face. The conversation shifted then. He talked about learning to read as an adult, helping other ex-prisoners find housing, and volunteering at youth centers to steer kids away from the mistakes he'd made. I shared stories about my messy family Christmases, and the time I bought the wrong wine for my boss's dinner party and nearly got fired. He laughed, a rough, genuine burst that filled the corner of the bar. We tasted different wines, debating cherry notes versus plum, and laughed when I accidentally knocked over a candle. He caught it before it hit the table, then winked as the flame trembled back to life. I realized the tattoos and the story were part of him, but so was a sense of humor and a kind heart. The bar's dim lights danced across his ink, illuminating symbols of survival rather than scar tissue. By the time we finished our flight, I felt a shift in my chest like a heavy door had opened. He asked if I'd meet him again. No borrowed photos, no experiments, just 2 people sharing wine. I said yes. He looked at me as if I'd given him a lifeline. I slid my chair back and stood, adjusting my shirt. Outside, the night air was cool, crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. We stood on the sidewalk, wine bar glow behind us. He hesitated, then reached out and shook my hand, a formal gesture that felt meaningful. I told him it was nice to meet him. He smiled, showing a chipped tooth that somehow fit the moment. "Thanks for giving me real me," he said. I walked away thinking about how easy it is to build a perfect facade online and how important it is to peek behind it sometimes. My phone buzzed with notifications I ignored as I headed home. I come for a smooth-talking finance bro and found someone with a story ink on his skin. And I couldn't wait to see what came next. I'd never thought ordering a latte could feel like the opening scene of a sitcom until I met Melissa. Her profile painted a picture of a bubbly 26-year-old barista. Sunlit selfies behind a latte art heart, photos of her pouring coffee with a perfect smile, and a bio that bragged about her signature vegan muffin recipe. She loved early morning shifts, swapping coffee tips on TikTok, and occasionally spinning vinyl in the shop's corner record nook. I swiped right partly because I have a thing for coffee geeks and partly because her smile looked like someone who'd appreciate my terrible coffee puns. We kicked off with messages that felt like a caffeine rush. She sent me photos of her latest latte art, a swan that looked more like a clumsy duck, and I replied with mock critiques. We swapped jazz of dancing coffee beans, talked about the best local roasteries, and shared our go-to orders. Hers, oat milk cappuccino with extra foam. Mine, double espresso with a shot of vanilla. Over a few days, she slid into my DMs with little coffee quizzes. I had to guess the bean origin or roasting method, and I laughed every time, convinced this was the most fun I'd had chatting online in ages. Then she suggested meeting at her cafe on a Thursday evening after her shift. She promised to show me the secret menu and teach me how to pull the perfect shot. I imagined a cozy shop bathed in warm light, the hiss of the espresso machine, and her leaning over the counter to hand me a freshly brewed cup. I wore my favorite shirt, practiced my best barista banter, extra foam with straight daggers, and headed out feeling like I'd found someone who shared my caffeine addiction. When I arrived, the cafe looked pretty much as promised: exposed brick walls, hanging Edison bulbs, a row of succulents on the windowsill. But behind the counter stood someone entirely unexpected. Instead of the youthful, bright-eyed barista I'd seen online, there was a woman in her mid-40s perched on a high stool behind the register. She wore a long, synthetic blonde wave that hung too perfectly, and when she smiled, I noticed metal brackets glued to her teeth like fake braces. My chest tightened as I realized every coffee snap, every latte art photo, was a heavily filtered version of her face, one she'd crafted with apps and face-tuning tools. I blinked and forced a smile, trying to hide how rattled I felt. She hopped down and gave me a sheepish wave. "Hey," she said, voice softer than expected. "Thanks for coming." I managed a nod and slid onto a stool. My notebook of questions about single-origin beans felt suddenly absurd. Instead, I watched her water down a tea and pour milk into a pitcher, hands that looked more practiced at typing than steaming milk. I waited for her to explain, and when she did, it felt part confession, part performance. She pulled off the wig and laid it on the counter, revealing silver roots and a streak of gray. Then she plucked at the fake braces until they clicked free and dropped into her apron pocket. She explained that she was actually 45 and had been using every filter and face app she could find to look 26. She said the braces made her jawline look rounder, more youthful, and the wig hid a receding hairline she'd felt too ashamed to show. Every photo on her profile had been tweaked: skin smoothing, eye enlarging, jaw sharpening. The works. She sighed and wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. "I know it's messed up," she said, "but I've spent years working here pouring coffee, getting to know people. Nobody sees the real me. They see wrinkles and decide I'm ancient before I can even say cappuccino." She admitted her plan was to match with someone who liked coffee as much as she did, then reveal the truth and watch their reactions, to see if anyone could look past the filters and still stick around. She called it her last-ditch experiment in feeling visible. A silence fell between us, broken only by the espresso machine's distant hiss. I stared at her real face close up, laugh lines around her eyes, a small scar on her cheek, the faint tremor in her hands. Behind her, handwritten chalk signs advertised new seasonal drinks: maple lavender latte, cardamom cold brew, none of which mentioned authenticity or honesty. I realized she treated human connection like a Photoshop project, layering on illusions until someone would notice. I cleared my throat and asked how she felt now that the mask was off. Her eyes darted around as if expecting me to storm out. When I said I still wanted a cappuccino, something genuine shifted. She blinked in surprise and set to work, pouring a drink with unfiltered hands. We sipped in silence at first, the flavor of nutty espresso and steamed oat milk filling the space between us. Then she started talking about the slump of her mornings before the shop opened, the laughter she shared with regulars, and the disappointment of watching someone's face fall when they learned her real age. I realized this date wasn't about frothy milk art or perfect selfies. It was about raw courage. She'd risked humiliation to see if someone could accept the person behind the edits. I asked her what she'd hoped I'd see beyond the filters, and she shrugged. Just me, she said. With all my wrinkles, real hair, and no science experiment attached. I told her that making an honest connection meant more than any filtered photo ever could. She smiled, that real smile that felt like a confession and a relief at once. We closed the cafe down together, wiping counters and stacking chairs, talking about everything from coffee bean farms to our favorite sitcoms. She confessed she'd always dreamed of being a stand-up comedian, but thought no one would laugh at a 45-year-old's jokes. I told her I'd happily buy tickets to that show if she ever gave it a shot. She laughed so hard milk almost frosted back onto the counter. When she'd finally locked up, we stepped into the cool night air lined with shop lights and the scent of roasting beans still lingering. She handed me a paper cup of the last cappuccino she'd made, crown latte art and all. On the sleeve she'd scribbled, "No filter needed." I slipped on my jacket, wrapped my hands around the warm cup, and felt the buzz of a date that had started in illusion but ended in something real. I walked home slower than usual, savoring each sip and thinking about how easy it is to hide behind a screen. She'd given up her filter factory for a chance at honesty. And somewhere between the foam and the real me seemed ready to meet the real her again. Wig and braces optional. I never thought a casual swipe could lead me to someone so desperate for one last shot at youth that he looked like he'd just rolled out of a Halloween costume shop. His profile photos were slick. A guy who could have passed for my peer, clear skin and dark hair perfectly in place, and a smile that meant, "I'm young, hair-free, and I belong here." The captions boasted about rooftop parties, electric concerts, and spontaneous road trips with friends. I was intrigued by his energy. I felt like I'd found someone to stretch my own boundaries. We started chatting about our favorite concerts. He claimed to have front row memories of indie bands. I bragged about my vinyl collection. And when he suggested meeting at a beachside tiki bar, I agreed. I pictured catching the sunset, sipping fruity drinks, and laughing about our shared love of 90s playlists. I dressed in a breezy button-up and jeans, slipped on my sandals, and headed down to the boardwalk, buzzing with excitement. When I arrived, the tiki bar's neon sign and palm fronds gave it that perfect tropical vibe. I scanned the crowded tables until I saw him, a man who looked 2 decades older than his profile suggested. His skin was unnaturally orange from spray tan, and his hairline was hidden beneath a shiny toupee that glinted under the bar lights. He wore a Hawaiian shirt 2 sizes too small, stretched tight across his paunch, and his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of regrets. My heart sunk. I wondered if I'd stumbled into some live prank. He caught my eye and waved, trying to act casual. I took a deep breath and walked over, sliding onto the bar stool beside him. He offered me a drink, a neon blue concoction with a tiny umbrella, and cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming," he said, voice edged with nerves. I managed a polite smile and accepted the drink, my pulse racing. He looked at me and explained breathlessly that the profile photos were from a younger version of himself, actually from 20 years ago, before time and life had caught up. He said he'd borrowed images from his college days, when he really did surf, dance at beach raves, and travel across the country in a beat-up van. Those snapshots were his glory days, he said, moments when he felt like he belonged with a younger generation. He admitted that he used filters to smooth wrinkles and sharpen his jawline, in hopes that someone might give him one last chance to feel like he belonged in this generation. I sat back and watched the tide of emotions wash over me, sympathy, confusion, frustration. Here was a man trying to outrun time by pretending to be the fresher, more vibrant version of himself. I remembered the enthusiastic messages about mosh pits and fire dancers, and realized none of it was real now. He explained that after a divorce and a series of stagnant office jobs, he felt like he'd lost his identity. The toupee, the spray tan, the borrowed photos. They were his desperate attempt to rewrite the past. I took a slow sip of my drink, its sweetness masking my unease. He told me about his ex-wife, who had left him for a younger man, and how that rejection had sent him into a spiral of self-doubt. He said his kids were grown and busy, and he felt invisible, like an old paperback gathering dust on a crowded shelf. He'd watched his youthful photos and felt jealous of the person he used to be. So he crafted this online persona, hoping someone might swipe, meet him, and see something worth loving beyond the forced tan and slick hairpiece. My thoughts drifted to all the times I'd judged profiles by their pictures. I'd never blamed a guy for using filters. Everyone does it to some extent, but this felt more like a time machine gone haywire. I asked him how it felt to be discovered. He winced and said it was terrifying. His heart had pounded when I sat down. He prepared a speech for if I asked questions, but he could see now that words felt hollow compared to raw honesty. We ordered real beers, Noni and Hughes, and I listened as he shared memories of road trips with his old college buddies, surfing at dawn, and dancing barefoot in muddy festival fields. He told me how those experiences shaped him and how he envied anyone who still had that spark. He paused and admitted fear of aging alone, fear of being forgotten, fear that no matter what he did now, he'd never recapture the freedom of his 20s. I looked at him under the bar's soft lighting, the spray tan uneven around his ears, the toupee struggling to cover a widening part, the lines around his eyes that no filter could erase. It struck me that we all chase moments that once defined us. I thought about my own insecurities, a second-guessing every photo I posted, and felt a pang of empathy. I asked if he ever tried showing up as himself, sharing stories instead of illusions. He shook his head, eyes misty. He said he'd been swamped by rejection messages when he tried dating honestly, like sorry not my type or silence after the first hello. So the Fox profile gave him instant matches, brief bursts of flattery, even if it ended in heartbreak at the reveal. I reached over and gave his hand a light squeeze. It's hard, I said, but you're more than a selfie from the past. He blinked, and I could almost see the weight lifting. I told him about a friend who'd met her partner through a book club. No filters, no illusions, just two people sharing chapters and opinions. He smiled at the image, as if book pages offered a refuge from virtual facades. We stood up to leave and agreed to walk along the boardwalk. The night air was cool and salty, the waves crashing softly. He laughed when a group of teens on skateboards zoomed by, and I realized he still had that spark in his eyes. I told him to keep that spark alive. He asked if I'd meet him again. No filters, no toupee, no spray tan. Just us and the ocean breeze. I nodded and smiled. As we parted ways under the glow of carnival lights, I felt a tug at my heart. His experiment started as a chase for lost youth, but ended in something real. A shared moment under the stars with someone brave enough to demand one more chance at belonging. I walked away knowing that the person behind the self-tanner and the wig mattered more than any filtered memory. And maybe that was the one piece of honesty worth swiping right for. It started when I swiped right on Kin's profile late one Sunday night. Her photos were full of vibrant color. A pale-skinned woman with a neon pink pixie cut standing in front of a graffiti wall, paint-splattered overalls, and an intense look that screamed underdog artist. She posted close-ups of her canvas, swirling abstracts, chunky brushstrokes, and bright geometric shapes. Her bio mentioned weekend gallery shows, midnight painting sessions fueled by espresso, and dreams of attending art school in Europe. I was drawn to someone so passionate and creative. Over the next few days, we messaged about favorite painters, recommended underground art spots, and shared song playlists for studio sessions. She asked me to guess which art movement inspired her latest piece, Cubism or Fauvism, and teased me when I guessed wrong. She sent me pictures of her sketchbook, charcoal portraits of strangers on the subway, doodles of mythical creatures, and notes in the margins about color theory. I felt like I was getting an exclusive backstage pass to her mind. When she suggested meeting at an outdoor mural festival in the old warehouse district, I said yes immediately. I pictured her guiding me through rows of painted walls, telling me the stories behind each mural, her eyes lighting up as she explained her techniques. I packed a small sketchbook, a set of pencils, and wore a paint-splattered denim jacket, just enough to look like I belonged in her world without trying too hard. That Saturday, I arrived at the warehouse district's open lot, surrounded by massive murals in every style imaginable. The smell of spray paint mingled with street food wafting from food trucks. I spotted a woman waving at me near a half-finished mural of a phoenix rising from smoky reds and purples. But as I approached, my heart lodged in my throat. The figure in front of me was nothing like the radiant art student from the photos. She was pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes. Her arms were frail, crowned with red, scaly patches that looked like crusting lesions. She wore a loose sweatshirt 3 sizes too big, leggings that revealed thin legs, and a soft beanie that hid what I guessed was hair loss. She smiled, the edges of her lips trembling, and I felt the jolt of panic mixed with concern. My brain raced. This wasn't the vibrant artist I'd imagined. It was someone fighting a battle I hadn't expected. I swallowed hard and offered a shy wave. She motioned me closer with a weak hand. The festival noise felt muffled as I sat on a folding stool beside her. She spoke softly. I know I looked different from my pictures. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She removed her cuff to reveal a rash's full extent. The photos were from last summer, before the treatment started. She explained that she'd recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness, an autoimmune condition that attacked her skin and drained her energy. Her art school dreams had been sidelined by hospital visits and experimental therapies. She used photos from when she felt better, before the lesions and the fatigue, to remind herself of who she used to be. My throat tightened. I realized every glowing photo, every confident pose with paintbrush in hand, was a snapshot of her healthiest moments. The festival crowd had thinned around us, but she kept painting, guided by her friends. She'd agreed to the meetup because she didn't want to disappear entirely. She needed someone to see her now, scared and fragile, and still care. I wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen for my art, not how I look, she said, eyes glistening. I watched as she dabbed paint onto the Phoenix mural, her hand shaking with effort. Each brushstroke was deliberate, precious. She told me how her condition made colors blur sometimes, how she painted to hold on to beauty whenever her vision wavered. The contrast between her real self and the bright photos was stark, but in that moment I saw her bravery. Here was someone who had risked heartbreak to expose her vulnerability. I asked what she hoped I'd see beyond the illness. She paused, her breath catching. That's still me, she said. The same person who loves bold strokes and midnight inspiration sessions, just a version marked by pain. She laughed softly, like it surprised her to still be cracking jokes. I'm not looking for pity. I'm looking for someone who gets the art, she added. I leaned in and picked up my sketchbook, pulling out a pencil. Can I paint with you? I asked. Her face lit up with a faint smile. She handed me a small jar of violet paint and a brush. As we worked side by side, I tried to focus on the mural's phoenix, its wings emerging from deep crimson, rising through streaks of yellow. Her lesions flared red against her pale skin, but her movements were deliberate, almost meditative. She guided my brush gently, correcting my angle, praising my lines. We talked quietly about suppliers, where to find the best acrylics, how to thin paint without losing vibrancy. Her voice grew stronger as she shared tips. She told me about her dream of running a workshop for kids with chronic illness, using art as therapy. I realized how much she was pouring into her vision despite the toll on her body. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, and the mural festival lights flickered on. We stood back to admire our joint piece. A phoenix partially rendered, its head and wing feathers bursting with color, its tail still a pencil sketch. She turned to me and pressed a thin hand to my arm. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered. I felt something shift inside me, a blend of awe and respect. Her courage to show up, masked and vulnerable, was more inspiring than any filtered photo. I closed my sketchbook and said, let's finish it together one day. She nodded, eyes bright despite exhaustion. As the festival wound down, we cleaned brushes and packed supplies into her small backpack. She walked with a careful gait, the legions cracking slightly at movement, but her spirit radiated warmth. We headed toward the exit, passing other murals in every style, some political, some whimsical, but ours felt personal, a testament to survival and hope. Before we parted ways, she slipped her hand into mine and gave it a gentle squeeze. I'll text you when I'm feeling strong enough for the next session, she said. I promised I'd be there, ready with paint and an open heart. Walking away under the warm glow of the warehouse lights, I realized I'd witnessed something real. The raw intersection of beauty and suffering, creativity and mortality. I felt grateful to have been chosen by someone who could have retreated into hospital rooms, but instead chose to share her vulnerable present. And I couldn't wait to see how the phoenix would rise, brushstroke by brushstroke, guided by her fierce determination and our shared passion for art. I never imagined a hiking date would end with me questioning my own assumptions about strength and beauty. When Christian's profile popped up on my screen, I paused. He looked like the kind of guy who lived for weekend getaways. Lean frame, sun-kissed skin, and photos of him perched on mountain ridges with a vintage backpack. His captions talked about chasing sunrise views, mapping out off-grid trails, and a love for campfire stories. I was drawn to his adventurous spirit. I could almost smell the pine and hear the wind in his snaps. We traded messages about favorite national parks, backpacking tips, and the best way to avoid bears on lonely trails. He sent me a short video of himself rappelling down a cliff face, his silhouette slicing through golden light. I watched it twice, caught in the thrill of seeing someone so fearless. When he suggested meeting at the State Forest Trailhead that Saturday, I agreed before I even thought it through. I pictured us lacing up boots, sharing trail mix, and trading stories about childhood camping trips. On the morning of our date, I arrived at the gravel parking lot, the scent of damp earth greeting me. I saw a figure near his car, helmet on the handlebars, and a canvas backpack at his feet. I waved and jogged over, ready to compliment his gear. But as I got closer, my breath caught. Christian wheeled himself towards me with careful grace, a sturdy wheelchair replacing the hiking boots I'd imagined. His arms were muscular, the result of pushing that chair over rough terrain, not swinging a trekking pole. My face must have registered my surprise because he offered a quick, sheepish smile. "Hey," he said, voice calm. "I know this might be unexpected." I swallowed and shook my head. "You're Christian." I managed, trying to sound casual. He nodded and extended his hand, then leaned back to navigate a patch of gravel. I stepped aside so he could aim his wheels at the narrow trail entrance. He explained that he'd been in a climbing accident years ago, crushing vertebrae, losing the ability to walk, but he refused to let gravity or pity keep him from the outdoors. He modified his chair with chunky off-road tires and reinforced frame, and taught himself how to wheel up inclines and down rocky paths. His photos of hikes were real. He'd been on every summit he posted. The rappelling video. He rigged a harness to his chair and lowered himself with custom gear. I felt my cheeks warm with both admiration and guilt for my assumptions. I followed as he edged onto the forest trail, the sunlight filtering through tall pines and dancing on the undergrowth. The path was narrow, roots jutting out like hurdles. Christian paused at each obstacle, shifting his weight and testing the ground before charging forward. I walked beside him, ready to help but also eager to see his technique. We reached a creek crossing where a fallen log served as a bridge. He looked at it, then at me, and shrugged. "Want to see if I can do this?" he asked. I held my breath as he balanced the front wheels on the log's edge, then lifted the back wheels up with a look of intense concentration. For a moment, he wobbled, and my heart thudded, but he straightened and clicked across with smooth precision. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and clapped. "That was amazing," I said, grinning. He smiled back, beads of sweat on his brow catching the light. We continued, the trail winding uphill through ferns and mossy boulders. He told me about his rehab, months of learning how to use his arms to propel himself, and the day he first wheeled through his local park without assistance. He said the forest gave him back a sense of freedom, even if his legs stayed silent. I realized his photos hadn't been illusions. They were invitations to share that freedom. At a clearing, he parked his chair under a pine and pulled out packed sandwiches wrapped in tin foil. We sat on a fallen log, sunlight warming our faces, and talked about everything from trail snacks to his favorite rock bands. I asked if people ever bailed when they met him in person. He shrugged and said there were some who did, but most stayed once they realized his personality was bigger than any pair of legs. He called it his social experiment, seeing if someone would choose the soul over the shell. We shared peanut butter and jelly squares, watching birds flit between branches. I realized how much easier it was to connect when the only filter was sunlight through leaves. He laughed when I tried to mimic a bird call and ended up sounding like a broken kazoo. His laughter rang out clear and genuine, and I felt a warm buzz that no profile picture could capture. After lunch, he suggested we head to a nearby ridge for the view. The path grew steeper and roots twisted across our route. I offered to help by lifting his front wheels. He shook his head. "Show me what you've got," he teased, challenge shining in his eyes. With his guidance, I lifted and steadied, and he pushed through the roots like a mountain goat. We hoisted a few boulders aside, and soon enough we were hauling up the final incline. Our hearts pounded in unison, and when we scrambled out onto a rocky outcrop, the forest unfurled beneath us in waves of green. We sat at the ridge's edge, legs dangling over nothingness, his in a wheelchair, mine swinging freely, and drank water from our flasks. The horizon stretched pink and gold as the afternoon sun dipped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just soaked in the silence. Then he turned to me and said, "Thanks for coming out here with me. I wasn't sure how you'd react." I shook my head. "I should have expected this," I admitted. "Your profile showed who you are, just left out the nobility part. But your spirit was there." He nodded, looking pleased. On the descent, we worked together to navigate the trickiest sections. I'd spot Lute's rocks and nudge them out of the way. He'd thank me with a grin that made my chest tighten. By the time we reached the parking lot, twilight shadows stretched along across the gravel. He wheeled himself to his car and opened the trunk, revealing hiking poles modified into handles for his chair, a small first aid kit, and a couple of old trail maps. Before I left, I asked if he'd meet again, maybe a winter trail or a park path with snow. He smiled and said that would be a blast. He packed up his gear and offered me a ride home, but I told him I'd walk to my car and suggested we catch up soon. He nodded, gave a small salute, and backed out of the lot. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the memory of his shadow sliding over the trail, the way the last rays of sun highlighted the curve of his shoulders. I realized that the real adventure wasn't in the photos I'd seen. It was in those moments of shared effort, trust, and genuine connection. Christian's experiment had shown me that bravery comes in many forms, and that true strength isn't measured by your legs, but by your willingness to push forward, one revolution of the wheel at a time. I'd been browsing profiles late one Friday night and stopped dead at Rania's pictures. Every selfie was flawless. Porcelain skin, bright almond-shaped eyes that looked like they lit up the frame, and an effortless smile that made me think she'd just stepped off a beauty shoot. Her bio talked about her love for botanical gardens and her weekend ritual of painting landscapes in watercolors. I was intrigued. Someone so naturally striking and creative had to have stories worth hearing. We matched, and our first messages felt light and genuine. She asked about my favorite park trails, sent me photos of her watercolor set laid out next to a steaming mug of tea, and joked about her tendency to overwater her ferns. I told her about my messy attempts at cooking and my guilty pleasure of reality cooking shows. Pretty soon we were swapping voice notes filled with laughter and playful teasing. It felt easy, and I liked that she seemed down to earth despite looking like a magazine cover. After a few days, she suggested meeting at an artsy cafe in the historic district, the kind with exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, and shelves of vintage board games. She promised to bring her latest watercolor piece for me to critique. I spent the afternoon feeling butterflies, imagining her bright smile and warm laugh as we sat over cups of chamomile tea. I grabbed my notebook, thinking I'd jot down notes about her painting style, and headed out. When I arrived, the cafe was exactly the kind of cozy place she described. I spotted her at a corner table, but something was off. Instead of the radiant woman from her selfies, I saw a figure wearing a heavy prosthetic mask. The skin looked rubbery, with rough texture around the cheeks and chin, and the eyes seemed set a fraction too deep. The mask's bow-shaped lips sat slightly crooked, and the hairline didn't meet naturally. It was a wig stretched over the edges. My heart skipped as I realized the flawless face in the photos had been entirely digital. I paused in the doorway, stomach twisting, and then walked over. She greeted me with a small, nervous wave, tugging at the edge of her scarf. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice softer than I expected. I sat down, my notebook feeling heavy in my bag. She pulled back the hood of her cardigan, revealing the mask's full circumference. My mind raced. Was this some odd performance art? A prank? She took a shaky breath. "I know this looks strange," she said, "but I want you to understand who I really am." She reached up, peeling the prosthetic mask away in one smooth motion. Underneath, I saw her true face, pitted with aching scars, uneven skin tone, and faint lines around the eyes. It was a face you wouldn't pause to notice in a crowd, but her eyes, were the same bright ones from her profile. They flicked with a mixture of fear and relief. She explained that her online images were heavily edited digital creations. Her digital self, she called it. She used apps to smooth her skin, widen her eyes, and sculpt her jawline until every photo looked airbrushed. The mask was her way of testing whether people could choose to love someone for who they were beneath the edits, not just the illusion. She told me she'd built the mask herself over months, sculpting it around her face so she could reveal her vulnerability like an experiment. My chest tightened as she spoke. Every message we'd exchanged, every voice note had been genuine, but anchored to a face that wasn't hers. She said beauty shouldn't be biology's lottery ticket. It should be a choice, a canvas you could paint at will. She wanted to see if anyone would stick around after the mask came off and the filters disappeared. Her voice cracked when she added that most people ghosted when she switched from the digital selfies to a candid photo of her real face. I stared at her bare skin, soft under the cafe's warm lights, a little uneven, but undeniably human. I realized I'd been chasing an image rather than a person. She looked at me with those same bright eyes and asked, "What do you see now?" My throat felt dry. I took a careful breath and said, "I see you, the person who paints watercolors, who laughs in voice notes, who builds masks for a reason that takes guts to explain." I watched relief wash over her features, a slow, genuine smile breaking through the tension. We spent the next hour talking about art and identity. She showed me the watercolor she'd brought, a soft depiction of a willow tree reflected in a pond. The strokes were expressive, full of emotion. She explained how she painted to reclaim her self-esteem, to channel frustration and hope into color. I asked about her mask-making process, and she described molding clay on her face, baking silicone, and hand-painting veins to make it look lifelike. Every detail a testament to her dedication. I shared my own insecurities, how I deleted countless selfies because I hated my crooked smile, and we laughed at the absurdity of spending so much time on filtered illusions. She told me about her digital drawings, where she'd imagined alternate versions of herself. A warrior queen with a crown of flowers, a dancer mid-leap surrounded by stardust. Those digital fantasies were her way of reminding herself she could be more than society's narrow definition of beauty. The cafe lights flickered as the afternoon waned, and I realized I hadn't looked at my phone or glanced at the doorbell. I felt present, connected. She packed up her watercolor tools, folding them carefully into her tote bag. I offered to walk her home, and she nodded. Outside, the historic district's cobblestone streets glowed in the late sunshine. As we walked, she described her dream of teaching art therapy to kids who'd been bullied for how they looked. She believed art could give people the power to paint their own identities, to choose beauty on their own terms. I told her I'd happily volunteer just to be part of that mission. She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that lit up her face. We stopped at her apartment building, a brick townhouse with climbing ivy. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for seeing me." I smiled back and asked if she'd like to meet again. No mask, no digital edits, just two people sharing space. Her eyes shone, and she nodded. She slipped a small card into my hand. On one side was a tiny watercolor of a willow tree. On the back she'd written, "True beauty is what you choose to see." I walked away feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The card weighed nothing, but in my pocket it felt like a compass, pointing me toward authenticity. I realized that her experiment had become mine, to choose to see beyond illusions and love the person underneath. And with every step, I found myself more eager to discover exactly who she was. No masks, no filters, just real skin and real stories waiting to be painted in vivid color. I never expected a Tuesday night chat to turn into a live sociology lecture, but that's exactly what happened when I met Ty. His profile pictures were impossible to ignore. A stunning guy with a chiseled jaw, smooth olive skin, and eyes that looked like they'd seen both sunrises on mountain peaks and city lights from rooftop bars. He posed against dramatic backdrops, desert dunes, urban murals, even a black and white shot in a leather jacket that screamed mysterious stranger. His bio dropped lines about exploring the world and breaking stereotypes, and I thought, here's someone who knows what they're doing. We messaged back and forth about travel dreams and favorite cuisines. He claimed a lifelong love of kimchi, and I confessed my weak spot for spicy street tacos. He asked about my hometown landmarks, recommending hidden cafes and street art alleys I'd never heard of. He sent me a photo of himself leaning against a brick wall covered in graffiti, and I felt that familiar spark of curiosity. When he suggested meeting for drinks at a trendy bar in the art district, I said yes immediately. That evening, I walked into the bar, neon signs reflecting off exposed pipes and concrete floors. I scanned every handsome face until I saw him, sort of. The man standing near the bar was pale, with a round jaw that blended into his neck, and hair so light it could have been bleached. His cheeks were smooth, but lacked the angular definition of his photos. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking more like someone who'd borrowed his roommate's clothes than the globe-trotting, stereotype-shattering figure I'd expected. My breath hitched. He gave me a wave that seemed half excited, half apologetic. I approached and introduced myself, feeling a mix of confusion and disappointment. His expression softened as he said, "I know this is a shock, and I realized this was no simple case of outdated photos. Something else was going on." He told me his name was Ty, and that the mixed-race man in the photos was his friend Mark, who'd given him permission to use those images. Ty was actually white, average-looking, and felt invisible in online dating. He said he'd grown up in a town where good bones and tan skin were prized, and he'd learned early that people judged before they knew your story. So he borrowed Mark's face to see how quickly someone would notice the difference between a model shot and raw reality. I felt my cheeks warm and asked why he'd do such an elaborate stunt. He leaned in, voice low. "Social commentary," he said. "I wanted to reveal our biases. How many people swipe right for a face and then ghost when it's not the type they expected? I wanted to collect real-time reactions." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's a pretty harsh experiment, I know." We ordered drinks. He chose a pale ale. I went for a gin and tonic, and I watched him fidget with the glass. I thought of all the times I'd swiped based on a glance, never considering the person behind the pixels. He talked about Mark's life, his travels through Southeast Asia, his volunteer work in orphanages, his mixed heritage that gave him that unique look. And I realized Ty had tapped into someone else's lived experiences for a commentary on bias. When I asked about his own life, he shrugged and admitted he hadn't done half as much. He worked in data entry, spent weekends streaming shows, and rarely got attention at bars. He said Mark's photos had unlocked a flood of matches, messages, and opportunities that never existed for him. Ty logged every response, categorizing them by emoji use, message length, and how quickly people arranged to meet up. It all felt clinical, like people were lab rats reacting to stimuli. My mind swirled as I sipped my drink. On one hand, I admired the audacity of his experiment. On the other, I felt betrayed. Every witty line I'd typed, every joke I'd sent, had been met with excitement for Mark's face, not Ty's personality. I remembered the joke about a food truck we bonded over, and realized I'd been talking to someone looking nothing like the profile. I told him how I felt, tricked, annoyed, but also intrigued. He nodded, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I wanted to force people to confront their biases," he said, "but I didn't expect it to feel so personal." He paused, eyes on his beer. The bar's low lights flickered, and I noticed the small scar above his eyebrow he'd never shown in photos. I asked what he hoped to achieve. He sighed. "I wanted to start a conversation. Show people that attraction is a social construct influenced by media, not just chemistry. But now it's starting to think it was selfish to use Mark's identity to prove a point." He took a long gulp, then set the glass down. The conversation shifted as I told him stories about my own missteps, posting a photo from 10 years ago because I thought it looked younger, cropping out parts of my apartment to look more put together. We laughed at how carefully curated life online had become. Ty shared how he once pretended to be a polyglot traveler to impress people, only to be exposed when someone asked him to say something in Portuguese. After another round of drinks, the night grew quieter. We moved to a high-top table away from the bar's glare and talked about what it means to be seen. Ty admitted he'd never felt truly noticed as himself, that behind Mark's face he received messages he craved, but at the cost of someone else's truth. I admired his vulnerability in admitting the experiment's toll. I asked if he'd ever show Mark's bias data in a gallery or write an article. He nodded. "I have the charts and charts of match rates, mixed race profile versus mine. It's undeniable." He smiled sadly. "But now I realize the real work is looking at ourselves and asking why we value certain looks over others." As the bar's last call approached, I stood and gathered my things. Ty did the same, his shoulders less tense. We walked outside into the cool air, neon signs painting the sidewalk. I paused and asked if he'd join me for coffee tomorrow. Honest conversation, no experiments. He looked surprised, then relieved. "I'd like that," he said. We exchanged numbers and said goodnight. As I walked away, I thought about how complicated attraction could be and how easy it was to forget the person behind the filter. Ty's experiment had been provocative, maybe even a bit harsh, but it forced me to examine my own snap judgments. And as I headed home, I realized that seeing someone's real face and story might be the most radical act of all. I'd stumbled on Karen's profile at midnight, half asleep and half curious, and her pictures stopped me dead. They were all soft pastel dresses, modest necklines, and prayers and captions, like she'd been plucked straight from a Sunday morning sermon. Her bio talked about Torah practice, volunteering at the food pantry, and how she lived by grace. I admit I got a warm, fuzzy feeling, picturing long drives to church picnics and sweet tea on a wraparound porch. We started chatting about our faith, her favorite Bible verses, how her youth group was planning a bake sale, and even details about her church's history. She sent me photos of her volunteering at the soup kitchen, handing out sandwiches with a radiant smile that made me think she was probably the kind of person who knits blankets for stray kittens on her days off. When she suggested meeting at this quaint cafe near the community center, I thought I'd found someone whose kindness was as genuine as her modest dresses. On the morning of the date, I showed up early and scanned the cafe's flower pots and wicker chairs. There was no one in a pastel sundress or lace cardigan, just a woman leaning against the counter, wearing a leather mini skirt, thigh-high boots, and a low-cut top that left almost nothing to the imagination. Her lips were plump like she'd just walked off a magazine cover, and she had this fierce, smoky eye makeup that clashed with the floral wallpaper behind her. My heart did a backflip, and I almost turned around on the spot. She flashed me a confident grin and waved me over. I sat down, my mouth dry, and she ordered an espresso martini without missing a beat. The waitress raised an eyebrow but poured it anyway. I waited for her to explain, thinking maybe this was some avant-garde performance piece. She caught my confused look and laughed, a sharp, edgy sound that didn't fit the chore girl image I'd expected. "I know I look nothing like my profile," she said, leaning forward with elbows on the table. The cafe's jazzy playlist felt a million miles away from church hymns. Those photos were from before I broke free from purity culture. She reached up and touched her lips, as if revealing the truth of her injections. When I left my old church, I kept the pictures up as a reminder of who I used to be. My head spun. I remembered those sweet Sunday selfies, her hair in a loose braid, hands folded in prayer. None of that was her current vibe. She explained that growing up, she'd been taught that women had to look demure and cover up to be respectable. She had followed every rule: long skirts, no makeup, no fun, until she realized her church's version of modesty felt more like control than faith. "So I got my lips done," she said with a wink, and a few other enhancements. She traced the edge of her mini skirt with her fingertip, the leather catching the light. "Now I dress how I want, take my own pictures, and post old ones just to remind myself of that old life." She shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world. I chewed on a packet of sugar while she talked about lip fillers, contouring tutorials, and the rush she got from taking control of her own image. She said it felt liberating to swap out a profile full of lace dresses for one that showed off tattoos and a collection of leather jackets. "I wanted to see if someone would love me for who I am now, not who they thought I used to be," she said. I took a sip of my lemonade and studied her: pierced ears, a chain hanging from her nose, and eyes lined thick with plaque. Her confidence was magnetic, but I felt a knot in my stomach thinking about the lie I'd fallen for. She leaned back and traced a heart onto the tablecloth with her manicured nail. "But you know what?" she continued. "It's exhausting pretending to be someone else, even if it was good girl Karen." I asked what she was hoping to find now that she'd stepped out of that world. She smiled, eyes softening. "Someone who can handle both sides of me," she said. "The girl who loves Sunday hymns, and the woman who rocks a corset and high heels on a Friday night." She let out a low laugh that somehow sounded like freedom. We talked for hours, swapping stories about our pasts. I told her about my weird experiment with a vegan diet and how I'd once dyed my hair green for a month. She told me about sneaking out of youth group to hit up underground raves, hiding in parking lots to text her friends about her doubts. She said learning to embrace her wild side felt like stepping off a cliff, but she realized faith wasn't about covering up, it was about honesty. She pulled out a deck of tarot cards from her purse and flipped one. "The Fool." "Perfect," she said. A fresh start. I laughed at the irony. Her old church would have disapproved, but she laid out the card between us like a proclamation. I nodded, thinking that maybe her authenticity was worth the initial shock. By the time the cafe started clearing out, we planned our next meetup. A thrift store hunt for vintage band tees, followed by karaoke at a dive bar. She grabbed her leather jacket, swung it over her shoulder, and gave me a sleazy smile. "You good with a little chaos?" she asked. I grinned back, feeling that same excitement I had scrolling through her old profile. As I walked back to my car, I thought about how easy it is to assume someone's story from a handful of photos, and how brave it was to tear down an image you once curated. Karen had traded a wholesome Christian girl for a look that could make people stare, and she'd done it all to reclaim her own narrative. I reached into my pocket and found my phone, ready to delete the old church memes I'd saved and replace them with something that felt more me. That night, I fell asleep thinking about living life on my own terms, slightly terrifying, slightly brilliant, and totally untamed. I've been swiping through profiles, mostly skipping gym selfies and mirror pics, until Lenny's photos caught my attention. He looked tall and lean, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt, hands shoved into the pockets of his perfectly fitted jeans, and standing against that pretty mural downtown. He had this confident tilt to his chin and a genuine smile that made me pause my thumb. His bio said he was into skateboard art, indie concerts, and midnight taco runs. Totally my vibe. We matched, and our first messages were a blast. He asked about my favorite local bands, shared a clip of a street artist painting a giant galaxy mural, and joked about dangerous taco combinations. I told him how I once tried ghost pepper salsa and lived to regret it, and he countered with a story about nearly burning his tongue off with that same challenge. After a few days of playful banter, he suggested we hit up that graffiti-covered skate park near the river. He said it was the perfect spot for late-night people watching and terrible street food. I was in. On the night of the date, I arrived under the flickering park lights, walls streaked with neon tags and half-finished murals. I scanned for someone in a fitted shirt and skinny jeans leaning on a rail, maybe checking his phone. Instead, I saw a much shorter guy, no taller than 5'1", wearing baggy cargo shorts and an oversized hoodie. He was leaning on a low wall, eating a questionable-looking taco from a paper tray. My heart sank for a second as I realized he didn't match the sleek figure in his photos. He waved me over with a grin that made his cheeks bounce. "Hey," he said, voice friendly and warm. "You must be—" He trailed off, blinking as if he was waiting for me to say something. I swallowed and managed a smile. "Lenny?" I asked, pointing at him. He laughed and nodded, wiping sauce from his fingers. Guilty as charged. We sat on folding chairs someone had left near a graffitied half-pipe, tacos in hand. He explained that the tall, lean guy in the pictures was a friend who let him borrow his body for the profile. In reality, Lenny was 5'1" and carried extra weight, something he said people overlooked online. He told me how every time he posted a real photo of himself, the matches would dry out. So he borrowed his friend's images to see if folks would swipe right on his personality before they judged his height or shape. I stared at my taco, suddenly bland. All those witty messages and late-night jokes had come from this shorter, heavier guy, not the lean skateboard artist I'd imagined. He explained that once matches agreed to meet, he'd reveal the truth early on and watch their reactions. Part art project, part personal experiment to confront shallow dating habits. He called it tall privilege envy, saying he felt like society rewarded height and slim bodies while he stayed invisible. My jaw ached from holding back a question. "Why risk it?" I finally asked. He shrugged, eyes flickering between hope and embarrassment. "I wanted to feel like I belonged for once," he said. "I wanted to see if someone would actually stick around when they knew the real me." He paused, then added, "Plus, I'm tired of thinking my worth is tied to my size." I took a deep breath, tasting the bitter tang of reality mixed with hot taco juice. I remembered how intrigued I'd been by the mural pics, the art clips, the witty taco banter. All of it had come from this guy, not the photos I'd liked. I felt anger and sympathy colliding in my chest. He looked at me, waiting. I cleaned a drip of sauce from my chin and said, "You know, I liked you before I knew your height or your weight. I liked your stories." He blinked, surprised. I nodded. "Your friend's photos got me swiping, sure. But our chats, those were you all along." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. "Really?" he asked, voice soft. I laughed and tossed him a napkin. "Really? Your size didn't change your humor, your taste in tacos, or how excited you got talking about late-night street art. His grin returned, broader this time, and his shoulders relaxed. We finished our tacos and walked along the river, the bridge lights reflecting in the water. He pointed out pieces of graffiti I'd missed, a tiny cartoon cat tucked between giant letters, a stencil of a dancer mid-twirl. He talked about how street art felt more honest than constant selfies, how the murals changed overnight, and how that unpredictability reminded him of life. At a bench, we sat side by side, legs dangling over the edge. He asked if I minded his extra weight or short height. I shrugged. I'm not here for a fashion show. I'm here for conversation, laughter, and maybe a midnight taco run. He laughed, elbow bumping mine, and I felt warmth spread through me. As the night cooled, he surprised me by pulling 2 cans of ginger beer from his backpack. He handed me one, popped a tab, and we toasted to unexpected surprises. I laughed because of how fitting the moment felt. We sipped the fizzy drink, watching the city lights dance off the water. I realized how shallow I'd been, assuming that tall, lean guy was the real Lenny. But the person in front of me, shorter, heavier, taco sauce stained, was the one who made me laugh and kept me talking. He pointed to a half-painted mural and asked if I'd help him finish a quick outline. I took the paintbrush he offered and added my own flourish, a small heart in bright yellow at the mural's corner. Lenny stepped back to admire our joint work, a smile painted across his face. Thanks, he said. This feels right. I nodded, thinking that the real connection wasn't built on borrowed images, but on shared moments under streetlights. When the clock neared midnight, I stood and stretched. He offered to walk me back to my car. We strolled past murals that looked different now. Some writ slogans, some hopeful scenes, but all of it felt alive. He asked if I'd like to meet again, maybe for a proper taco crawl in the morning. I smiled and said yes. At my car, he waved goodbye and slipped his jacket off to give me a proper hug. I laughed as he wrapped me in that oversized hoodie and said, "Look at us, sharing your friend's jacket now." I gave him a playful punch on the arm and got in. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing under the mural lights, waving. I felt a grin spread across my face. I realized that sometimes the best surprises come when you look past the highlight reel and discover the real person underneath. And if Taco Run Test 2 was on the menu tomorrow morning, I was more than ready for round 2, short, heavy set, and totally worth it. I didn't expect a quiet bookstore meetup to turn into something straight out of a Nora graphic novel, but that's exactly what happened when I met Kayla. Her profile photos showed a girl buried in oversized cardigans, hair in a loose bun, glasses perched on her nose, and stacks of classic novels piled around her like trophies. She loved cozy reading nooks, whispered recommendations about obscure authors, and promised that meeting her would feel like stumbling into your favorite library's hidden corner. I was immediately charmed by the idea of someone who valued silence and stories over loud bars and selfies. We messaged about favorite authors. She admired Murakami's surreal worlds. I confessed a soft spot for Raymond Chandler's hard-boiled prose, and swapped pictures of our bookshelves. She sent me a snap of her reading chair, a battered armchair next to a floor lamp, and I promised I'd meet her there if I ever got the chance. After a week of gentle conversation, she suggested meeting at an indie bookstore's cafe. She said it served lavender-infused lattes and had secret back rooms for book clubs. It sounded perfect. On the afternoon of our date, I arrived at the quiet storefront tucked between an art gallery supply shop and a vintage vinyl store. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and chase spices. I spotted the cafe table on the back wall, and rather than seeing her in her comfy cardigan, I saw a woman in full dominatrix gear, knee-high leather boots, a sleek corset, fishnet stockings, and a riding crop resting beside her latte. Her hair was slicked back into a severe ponytail, and her glasses had given way to smoky lenses. I froze, heart pounding, as she looked up and offered a slow, expectant smile. I sat down, my throat tight. The cafe's hushed atmosphere suddenly felt electric. She set down her cup and removed her gloves, revealing long, painted nails. She leaned forward, voice low but steady, and said, "Surprise." The reading nook vibe vanished in an instant, replaced by something bold and provocative. I watched her tap the writing crop on the table and wondered if I'd walked into the wrong meeting entirely. She explained that the shy, bookish persona was her way of weeding out people who chased cliches. She used the cardigan photos to attract quiet types, men who appreciated subtlety and deep conversation. But once she identified her prey, she'd reveal her true self, something more powerful, commanding, and daring. She called it an experiment in control, to see who could handle the shift from timid academic to confident dominatrix in one smooth pivot. My pulse hammered as she continued. She said real women don't always get to dictate the narrative online, so she created a persona that people assumed they understood. Then she threw them off balance with the revelation. According to her rules, only someone open-minded and adaptable would stick around after the surprise. She wanted to separate the curious from the judgmental. I blinked, trying to process it all. The writing crop felt like a symbol of her authority, tapping out a rhythm on my anxiety. I wondered how many men she'd tested this on, how many matches ended with a quick costing once they saw her reveal. My mind flashed to our text threads about Faulkner and existentialism. Everything had felt so genuine, so understated, and yet it had been a lure for something entirely different. She leaned back and offered me a drink from her cup. Lavender latte, she asked with a crooked grin. I nodded, suddenly thirsty despite the tension. I took a careful sip, the floral flavor soothing my racing thoughts. She told me that behind the leather and latex was still a lover of books. She just chose to explore another side of herself. The dominatrix persona was about empowerment, not degradation. She'd studied kink dynamics, read essays on consent, and saw her reveal as an act of honesty rather than deceit. I set my cup down and asked why she picked me. She smiled, eyes glinting. You seem like someone who listened, she said. Someone who didn't just see a photo and judge it. You've asked about my favorite scenes, not about my look. Her gaze felt piercing, as if she were measuring my reaction. I swallowed and realized she'd been testing me all along. Across the table, she retrieved a small notebook from her bag. Inside were scrawled notes: trust, curiosity, flexibility. She called it her compatibility checklist. I wondered how many of her dates had crumbled the moment the first picture changed. She said she wasn't interested in shallow followers, only in people willing to dive into the unexpected. I remembered how she quoted Proust and laughed over my terrible poetry attempts. That genuine connection had drawn me in before I ever thought about her clothes. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. I won't walk away, I said softly. Her lips curved into a satisfied smile, and she tapped the crop once more before tucking it under the table. We spent the next hour talking about identity, how we all wear masks to protect ourselves, but sometimes those masks hide too much. She admitted that while she loved her dominatrix persona, she feared it might scare people off. She was looking for someone who could navigate both worlds, the hushed corners with dog-eared novels and the bold realms of her darker fantasies. As the cafe lights dimmed for closing, she folded the notebook and slipped it back into her bag. I offered to walk her home, or rather, to the discreet apartment where she hosted her workshops on empowerment and self-expression. She hesitated, then nodded. Outside, under a sky turning dusky purple, I realized she had trusted me enough to invite me into her private sanctuary. On the walk, she shed the smoky lenses and fishnets for her pale scarf and a simple top beneath her corset. In the glow of the bookstore's side, she looked like a blend of both personas, strong yet vulnerable. We talked about upcoming art shows, a Nor film festival, and the possibility of me attending her next empowerment session. I found myself genuinely excited. At her door, she turned and said, "Thank you for being open." Her expression was sincere, unguarded. I replied that I was grateful for the adventure. She slipped a tiny paperback into my hand, 50 Shades of Consent, a guide she recommended. On the cover she'd written, "To brave storytellers." I tucked it into my pocket, feeling its weight as a promise of trust. I walked away under the streetlights, the bookstore's neon sign flickering behind me. My mind buzzed with the contradictions she embodied: softness and strength, silence and command. I realized that true connection wasn't about sticking to one image. It was about embracing the full spectrum of who someone could be. As I headed home, I found myself eager to turn the next page in her story, no matter where her jewel worlds would lead us. Jason's profile was a mouth-watering scroll of pristine kitchen shots, sleek stainless steel counters, perfectly seared scallops, and artful swirls of foam on espresso cups. He called himself a culinary artist and dropped references to molecular gastronomy and farm-to-table philosophy. I was starved for something more refined than my usual pizza and beer routine, so I swiped right without a second thought. We messaged about favorite spices, swapped tips on plating techniques, and he even sent me a photo of himself in a crisp chef's jacket holding a tray of artisanal sliders. I admired his confidence in calling the sliders mini masterpieces when he suggested meeting at that upscale bistro downtown, where reservations were notoriously hard to snag. I was thrilled. I polished my shoes, pressed my shirt, and arrived early, imagining the date would be full of rich sauces and decadent desserts. The bistro's entrance was discreet, tucked behind a vine-covered facade. Inside, the lighting was dim and intimate, tables dressed in white linen. I scanned the room for a tall guy in a chef's coat, perhaps chatting with the staff. Instead, I saw someone hunched over a booth at the far end, wearing a stained baseball cap and a greasy apron that looked like it belonged in a diner, not a fine dining establishment. When I approached, he looked up, blinking against the warm glow of the candle on the table. His apron read "Quick Bites" in block letters. "Jason," I asked, trying to steady my voice. He stood and nodded, shoulders slumping as he brushed lint off his apron. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Thanks for coming." I sat down, heart pounding, and gestured toward the table. The server appeared with a wine menu before I could ask a single question. I watched Jason sink into the seat, apron bunching at his waist, and waited for an explanation. He cleared his throat and said, "I know this is going to sound insane, but I'm not really a chef here." He gestured at the bistro's polished servers. "I actually work at a fast food joint down the street." My mind raced. The polished sliders, the molecular gastronomy talk. All of it had come from someone in a uniform that looked more like a sloppy diner than a haute kitchen. When I raised an eyebrow, he went on, "I borrowed the photos from the head chef at my old culinary school." He explained that after dropping out, he'd taken a job flipping burgers to pay rent. He missed the high-end kitchens and the rush of plating a course that felt like art. He snagged photos of his schoolmates' work, ones tagged online with hashtags like #cheflife and #foodporn, and set them up as his own. He figured no one would swab a finicky Instagram account to check credentials. His little experiment was to see if anyone could spot the difference between a menu at a 3-star restaurant and a combo meal. I flicked through the wine list, half listening. He admitted he'd done it for the thrill, to taste the validation that came with compliments on his dishes. He logged responses, who praised the foam on the cappuccino, who asked for the secret ingredient in the juice. When someone agreed to meet, he'd reveal his real job, burger buns and all, and watch their reaction. He called it culinary anthropology, but I thought it sounded like a fast food confession session. I sipped my water, trying to keep my face neutral. He looked genuinely nervous, like a student waiting for results. The server came back to ask for orders. I told her I needed a minute, glancing at the appetizer section, truffle fries, endive salad, seared scallops. I thought about ordering something expensive to match the vibe he conjured online, but instead I said, "What do you recommend for a kitchen rookie?" He blinked, surprise flickering across his face. Then he pointed at the shrimp cocktail, simple, honest, no frills. We ordered shrimp cocktails and a shared pepperoni pizza straight from the wood-fired oven special. The juxtaposition felt right. When the shrimp arrived, he leaned over and said, "I can actually make this in my sleep." I laughed, realizing how natural he looked describing something he'd cooked 1,000 times. Just not at this level. He told me about his after-work routine, wiping grease off his apron clocking out, then practicing knife skills on chicken breasts at home. He said he dreamed of a kitchen where he could call the shots again, but life had him flipping patties for now. Between bites of crisp shrimp and gooey pizza, our conversation turned personal. He confessed that the deception had started as a dare among friends, just a ridiculous stunt, but snowballed into this game of profiles and meets. He admitted shame for lying, but also a strange pride in proving that the stories behind images mattered more than the images themselves. He paused, eyes on the candle flame, and said, "I wanted someone to connect with the food, not the fancy uniform." I thought about how I'd been fooled by brass rails, plated foam, and a chef's jacket, but his genuine passion for ingredients shone through, even in a greasy apron. He described the best secret sweetener hacks for burger glazes, the perfect ratio of lettuce to meat in a sandwich, and the way ketchup could be art if you drizzled it right. He was a food lover at heart, not a posh kitchen snob. His excitement about a fresh batch of fries felt more honest than any molecular foam tutorial I'd ever read. When our plates were empty, I suggested dessert, maybe something signature from his supposed bistro. He laughed and flagged down the server for 2 milkshakes. He told me he could make a mean shake himself, and we talked about the joy of mixing flavors without worrying about plating. The sweetness of the chocolate and vanilla swirl reminded me of childhood diners and carefree nights. As we finished our shakes, I realized I hadn't checked my watch once. The awkwardness had melted away under the warmth of honest conversation. I looked at his apron, frayed at the edges, a little greasy, and saw a guy who loved cooking regardless of the setting. I asked if he'd ever try applying for real chef positions again, and he admitted he had dreams of reopening that old culinary portfolio to fresh employers. He said he worried no one would give him the chance after the fast food stint, but maybe an honest approach would work better than borrowed photos. When the dessert plates were cleared, I stood and gathered my bag. He fished out his phone and showed me photos of his real creations. Homemade tomato sauce on pasta, a perfectly browned roast chicken, even a stack of fluffy pancakes that looked undeniably delicious. I nodded in approval. No foam needed. He smiled, relief in his eyes. We walked out into the cool night, the bistro lights fading behind us. I told him I'd enjoyed the night more than I expected, and that I appreciated his honesty. He looked hopeful and asked if I'd meet him again. Maybe at his fast food joint for an all-you-can-eat fries challenge. I laughed and said yes, because I realized that what mattered wasn't the background or the uniform, but the person behind the apron. As I drove home, I thought about how easy it was to be dazzled by curated images, and how refreshing it was to find someone who could cook a real meal without the frills. I couldn't wait to see what Lenny's shakes tasted like at the diner, and more than anything, I looked forward to learning the story behind every dish, one honest bite at a time. So this girl, Lindsay, her profile pictures were a scroll stopper. Long, glossy blonde hair cascading over designer gowns, a perfect pageant-ready smile, and eyes that looked airbrushed against bougainvillea backdrops. Every image screamed Hollywood glamour, and her captions mentioned VIP parties, high fashion shoots, and weekend escapes to private beaches. I'm not going to lie. I swiped right hoping for a fairy tale moment, not a behind-the-scenes reality check. We chatted about runway trends and our favorite red carpet moments. She sent me photos of a glittering tire she'd borrowed for a friend's shoot and a backstage video where models floored me with smoky eye makeup tutorials. She signed off one voice note with, "You've got to see me in person. It's a whole other level." Naturally, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? On Saturday afternoon, she suggested meeting at a trendy cafe known for its rose-colored lats and plant walls. I dressed in my nicest casual, jeans and a crisp blouse, and arrived early, heart pounding with excitement. When I pushed open the cafe door, I looked past the monstera leaves and pastel cushions, expecting to see Lindsay's signature blonde waves. Instead, there she was in the corner wearing a leopard print hoodie, heavy stage makeup caked on thick, and a bald cap stretched tight over her head. She looked like a glam rocker in mid-transformation, halfway between a beauty queen and a Halloween costume. My jaw dropped for a full beat before I forced a grin and waved. "Hey," she said, voice steady but softer than the glamorous persona I'd imagined. "Thanks for coming." I slid into the seat across from her, feeling equal parts stunned and curious. She pulled off the hood, and I finally saw her real face, pale skin dotted with freckles, sparse eyebrows, and a smooth scalp. She reached up and removed the bald cap in one smooth motion, revealing her shiny head. My mind reeled. The perfect blonde hair in her photos had been a wig, and the flawless pageant face was all makeup. She leaned forward, clasping her hands together on the table. "I know this is a lot," she said, "but I wanted you to see me, exactly me." She explained that she'd lost her hair early in adulthood, a combination of genetics and stress, and the wigs helped her feel like the confident version she craved. The pageant-style makeup, that was her attempt to lean into a fantasy she'd built about herself years ago, back when she thought a woman needed perfect features to matter. She posted those photos as a shield, hoping no one would notice the truth beneath the glitter. I stared at my rose latte, swirling pale pink foam, while she continued. She admitted she kept the glam persona up online to feel worthy, believing that no one would swipe right on a bald woman without eyelashes or eyebrow arches. She said the wigs and heavy makeup were her armor against a world that equated hair and flawless skin with beauty. This date was her experiment. Would someone see past the illusion and still care about her story? My mind flashed back to every compliment I'd given her pictures and every question I'd asked about her vintage gown choices. All of it had been based on a look that wasn't really hers. I pulled myself together and met her gaze. "You're brave," I said quietly. "It takes guts to show up like this." She exhaled, relief flickering across her painted cheeks. She told me about the first time she wore a wig in public. It was like borrowing someone else's confidence, and it felt freeing at first. But every time she caught her real reflection, she cringed at the sight of stubble where her hairline should have been. The wigs and makeup had become a routine. Glue on the cap, draw on the brows, paint on the lips. She described it all with a kind of detached precision, like she'd given lectures on the subject. I sat up straighter. "What do you want me to see?" I asked. She paused, tracing circles on the table's marble surface. "The real me," she said. "Not the wig-wearing pageant queen, but the woman beneath. The one who loves horror films, who reads sci-fi novels, who paints abstract art in her spare time." She smiled a little. I wanted to know if someone could love that me, even if I looked nothing like my photos. I nodded, thinking about my own quirks, my obsession with vintage comic books, and my habit of singing badly in the shower. I told her I valued authenticity more than a perfect hairline. She let out a laugh, half relief, half surprise. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a tiny canvas on a miniature easel. Painted on it was a bold swirl of neon colors, an abstract piece she'd done during one of those long makeup sessions. We spent the next hour talking art and movies. She told me about her favorite indie bands, the sci-fi conventions she'd sneak into, and the surreal novel she was drafting in her head. I told her about my weekend D and D group and the time I tried making homemade pasta. With each genuine detail, the conversation felt more alive than any filter could produce. At one point, she reached into her hoodie pocket and handed me a small card. On one side was a Polaroid of her in full pageant regalia, the perfect blonde wig, the glittery dress, the sparkling tiara. On the back she'd written, "Thank you for seeing both sides." I slipped it into my wallet, feeling its weight like a promise. As the cafe lights dimmed for closing, she stood and offered to walk me outside. Under the string bulbs strung across the patio, she took off the rest of her makeup with gentle strokes, wiping away smoky eyeshadow and thick liner until her skin looked like canvas ready for a fresh painting. Her freckles peeked through, and I realized she was beautiful on her own terms. At the door, she asked if I'd meet her again. No wigs, no heavy makeup, just two people in a late-night movie marathon. I smiled and said yes. She winked, tucked her hoodie back on, and slipped into the night. Walking to my car, I thought of the layers we all wear to feel acceptable. Lindsay had traded her pageant persona for honesty in one brave move. And as I settled into my driver's seat, I found myself eager to know her real stories, the ones waiting behind the wigs and the glitter, because sometimes the hardest reveal is the most beautiful woman of all.